Chapter 1 of Planet of the Damned. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Phil Chenevert, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. This book was first published in 1962. Planet of the Damned by Harry Harrison. Chapter 1. A man said to the universe, "Sir, I exist." "However," replied the universe, "the fact has not created in me a sense of obligation." Stephen Crane. Sweat covered Brian's body, trickling into the tight loincloth that was the only garment he wore. The light fencing foil in his hand felt as heavy as a bar of lead to his exhausted muscles, worn out by a month of continual exercise. These things were of no importance. The cut on his chest, still dripping blood, the ache of his overstrained eyes, even this soaring arena around him with the thousands of spectators, were trivialities not worth thinking about. There was only one thing in his universe, the button-tipped length of shining steel that hovered before him, engaging his own weapon. He felt the quiver and scrape of its life, knew when it moved, and moved himself to counteract it. And when he attacked, it was always there to beat him aside. A sudden motion, he reacted, but his blade met just air. His instant panic was followed by a small, sharp blow high on his chest. "Touch!" A world-shaking voice bellowed the word to a million waiting loudspeakers, and the applause of the audience echoed back in a wave of sound. 1 minute, a voice said, and the time buzzer sounded. Brian had carefully conditioned the reflex in himself. A minute is not a very large measure of time, and his body needed every fraction of it. The buzzer's whir triggered his muscles into complete relaxation. Only his heart and lungs worked on at a strong, measured rate. His eyes closed, and he was only distantly aware of his handlers catching him as he fell, carrying him to his bench. While they massaged his limp body and cleansed the wound, all of his attention was turned inward. He was in reverie, sliding along the borders of consciousness. The nagging memory of the previous night loomed up then, and he turned it over and over in his mind, examining it from all sides. It was the very unexpectedness of the event that had been so unusual. The contestants in the 20s needed undisturbed rest. Therefore, nights in the dormitories were as quiet as death. During the first few days, of course, the rule wasn't observed too closely. The men themselves were too keyed up and excited to rest easily. But as soon as the scores began to mount and eliminations cut into their ranks, there was complete silence after dark. Particularly so on this last night, when only 2 of the little cubicles were occupied, the thousands of others standing with dark, empty doors. Angry words had dragged Brian from a deep and exhausted sleep. The words were whispered, but clear. 2 voices, just outside the thin metal of his door. Someone spoke his name. "Brian Brand." "Of course not. Whoever said you could was making a big mistake, and there is going to be trouble." "Don't talk like an idiot," the other voice snapped with harsh urgency, clearly used to command. "I'm here because the matter is of utmost importance, and Brand is the one I must see. Now stand aside." "The 20s? I don't give a damn about your games, hearty cheers and physical exercises. This is important, or I wouldn't be here." The other didn't speak. He was surely one of the officials, and Brian could sense his outraged anger. He must have drawn his gun because the intruder said quickly, "Put that away. You're being a fool." "Out." was the single snarled word of the response. There was silence, and, still wondering, Brian was once more asleep. 10 seconds. The voice chopped away Brian's memories, and he let awareness seep back into his body. He was unhappily conscious of his total exhaustion. The month of continuous mental and physical combat had taken its toll. It would be hard to stay on his feet, much less summon the strength and skill to fight and win a touch. "How do we stand?" he asked the handler who was kneading his aching muscles. 4-4. All you need is a touch to win. "That's all he needs, too," Brian grunted, opening his eyes to look at the wiry length of the man at the other end of the long mat. No one who had reached the finals in the 20s could possibly be a weak opponent. But this one, Airolg, was the pick of the lot. A red-haired mountain of a man with an apparently inexhaustible store of energy. That was really all that counted now. There could be little art in this last and final round of fencing. Just thrust and parry, and victory to the stronger. Brian closed his eyes again, and knew the moment he had been hoping to avoid had arrived. Every man who entered the 20s had his own training tricks. Brian had a few individual ones that had helped him so far. He was a moderately strong chess player, but he had moved to quick victory in the chess rounds by playing incredibly unorthodox games. This was no accident, but the result of years of work. He had a standing order with off-planet agents for archaic chess books, the older the better. He had memorized thousands of these ancient games and openings. This was allowed. Anything was allowed that didn't involve drugs or machines. Self-hypnosis was an accepted tool. It had taken Brian over 2 years to find a way to tap the sources of hysterical strength. Common as the phenomena seemed to be in the textbooks, it proved impossible to duplicate. There appeared to be an immediate association with the death trauma, as if the two were inextricably linked into one. Berserkers and juramentados continued to fight and kill, though carved by scores of mortal wounds. Men with bullets in the heart or brain fought on, though already clinically dead. Death seemed an inexplicable part of this kind of strength. But there was another type that could easily be brought about in any deep trance: hypnotic rigidity. The strength that enables someone in a trance to hold his body stiff and unsupported except at 2 points, the head and heels. This is physically impossible when conscious. Working with this as a clue, Brian had developed a self-hypnotic technique that allowed him to tap this reservoir of unknown strength, the source of second wind, the survival strength that made the difference between life and death. It could also kill. Exhaust the body beyond hope of recovery, particularly when in a weakened condition as his was now. But that wasn't important. Others had died before during the 20s, and death during the last round was in some ways easier than defeat. Breathing deeply, Brian softly spoke the auto-hypnotic phrases that triggered the process. Fatigue fell softly from him, as did all sensations of heat, cold, and pain. He could feel with acute sensitivity, hear and see clearly when he opened his eyes. With each passing second, the power drew at the basic reserves of life, draining it from his body. When the buzzer sounded, he pulled his foil from his second's startled grasp and ran forward. Airolg had barely time to grasp up his own weapon and parry Brian's first thrust. The force of his rush was so great that the guards on their weapons locked, and their bodies crashed together. Airolg looked amazed at the sudden fury of the attack. then smiled. He thought it was a last burst of energy. He knew how close they both were to exhaustion. This must be the end for Brian. They disengaged, and Irolg put up a solid defense. He didn't attempt to attack, just let Brian wear himself out against the firm shield of his defense. Brian saw something close to panic on his opponent's face when the man finally recognized his error. Brian wasn't tiring. If anything, he was pressing the attack. A wave of despair rolled out from Irolg. Brian sensed it and knew the fifth point was his. Thrust, thrust, and each time the parrying soared a little slower to return. Then the powerful twist thrusted aside, in and under the guard. The slap of the button on flesh, and the arc of steel that reached out and ended on Irolg's chest over his heart. Waves of sound, cheering and screaming, lapped against Brian's private world, but he was only remotely aware of their existence. Irolg dropped his foil and tried to shake Brian's hand, but his legs suddenly gave way. Brian had an arm around him, holding him up, walking towards the rushing handlers. Then Irolg was gone, and he waved off his own men, walking slowly by himself. Except that something was wrong, and it was like walking through warm glue, walking on his knees. No, not walking, falling. At last, he was able to let go and fall. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2 of Planet of the Damned by Harry Harrison. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 2. Igel gave the doctors exactly 1 day before he went to the hospital. Brian wasn't dead, though there had been some doubt about that the night before. Now, a full day later, he was on the mend, and that was all Igel wanted to know. He bullied and strong-armed his way to the new Winter's room, meeting his first stiff resistance at the door. "You're out of order, Winter Igel," the doctor said. "And if you keep on forcing yourself in here where you are not wanted, rank or no rank, I shall be obliged to break your head." Igel had just begun to tell him in some detail just how slim his chances were of accomplishing that, when Brian interrupted them both. He recognized the newcomer's voice from the final night in the barracks. "Let him in, Dr. Cowrie," he said. "I want to meet a man who thinks there is something more important than the 20s. While the doctor stood undecided, Igel moved quickly around him and closed the door in his flushed face. He looked down at the Winter in the bed. There was a drip plugged into each of Brian's arms. His eyes peered from sooty hollows. The eyeballs were a network of red veins. The silent battle he fought against death had left its mark. His square, jutting jaw now seemed all bone, as did his long nose and high cheekbones. They were prominent landmarks, rising from the limp grayness of his skin. Only the erect bristle of his close-cropped hair was unchanged. He had the appearance of having suffered a long and wasting illness. "You look like sin," Igel said, "but congratulations on your victory." "You don't look so very good yourself, for a Winter," Brian snapped back. His exhaustion and sudden peevish anger at this man let the insulting words slip out. Igel ignored them. But it was true. Winter Igel looked very little like a Winter, or even an Anvarian. He had the height and the frame all right, but it was draped in billows of fat, rounded, soft tissue that hung loosely from his limbs and made little limp rolls on his neck and under his eyes. There were no fat men on Anvar. and it was incredible that a man so gross could ever have been a winner. If there was muscle under the fat, it couldn't be seen. Only his eyes appeared to still hold the strength that had once bested every man on the planet to win the annual games. Brian turned away from their burning stare. Sorry now he had insulted the man without good reason. He was too sick, though, to bother about apologizing. Igel didn't care either. Brian looked at him again and felt the impression of things so important that he himself, his insults, even the 20s, were of no more interest than dust motes in the air. It was only a fantasy of a sick mind, Brian knew, and he tried to shake the feeling off. The two men stared at each other, sharing a common emotion. The door opened soundlessly behind Igel, and he wheeled about, moving as only an athlete of Anvar can move. Dr. Colry was halfway through the door, off balance. Two men in uniform came close behind him. Igel's body pushed against them, his speed and the mountainous mass of his flesh sending them back in a tangle of arms and legs. He slammed the door and locked it in their faces. "I have to talk to you," he said, turning back to Brian. "Privately," he added, bending over and ripping out the communicator with a sweep of one hand. "Get out," Brian told him. "If I were able—" "Well, you're not, so you're just going to have to lie there and listen. I imagine we have about 5 minutes before they decide to break the door down, and I don't want to waste any more of that. Will you come with me off-world? There's a job that must be done. It's my job, but I'm going to need help. You're the only one who can give me that help. Now refuse," he added as Brian started to answer. "Of course I refuse," Brian said, feeling a little foolish and slightly angry, as if the other man had put the words into his mouth. "Anvar is my planet. Why should I leave? My life is here, and so is my work. I also might add that I have just won the 20s. I have a responsibility to remain." "Nonsense. I'm a winner, and I left. What you really mean is you would like to enjoy a little bit of the ego inflation you have worked so hard to get. Off Anvar, no one even knows what a winner is, much less respects one. You will have to face a big universe out there, and I don't blame you for being a little frightened." Someone was hammering loudly on the door. "I haven't the strength to get angry," Brian said hoarsely. "And I can't bring myself to admire your ideas when they permit you to insult a man too ill to defend himself." "I apologize," Igel said, with no hint of apology or sympathy in his voice. "But there are more desperate issues involved than your hurt feelings. We don't have much time now, so I want to impress you with an idea." "An idea that will convince me to go off planet with you? That's expecting a lot." "No, this idea won't convince you, but thinking about it will. If you really consider it, you will find a lot of your illusions shattered. Like everyone else on Anvar, you're a scientific humanist, with your faith firmly planted in the 20s. You accept both of these noble institutions without an instant's thought. All of you haven't a single thought for the past, for the untold billions who led the bad life as mankind slowly built up the good life for you to lead. Do you ever think of all the people who suffered and died in misery and superstition while civilization was clicking forward one more slow notch?" "Of course I don't think about them," Brian retorted. "Why should I? I can't change the past." "But you can change the future," Igel said. "You owe something to the suffering ancestors who got you where you are today. If scientific humanism means anything more than just words to you, you must possess a sense of responsibility, Don't you want to try and pay off a bit of this debt by helping others who are just as backward and disease-ridden today as great-grandfather Troglodyte ever was? The hammering on the door was louder. This and the drug-induced buzzing in Brian's ears made thinking difficult. Abstractly, I of course agree with you, he said haltingly. But you know there's nothing I can do personally without being emotionally involved. A logical decision is valueless for action without personal meaning. Then we have reached the crux of the matter, Igel said gently. His back was braced against the door, absorbing the thudding blows of some heavy object on the outside. They're knocking, so I must be going soon. I have no time for details, but I can assure you upon my word of honor as a winner that there is something you can do. Only you. If you help me, we might save 7 million human lives. That is a fact. The lock burst and the door started to open. Igel shouldered it back into the frame for a final instant. Here is the idea I want you to consider. Why is it that the people of Anvar, in a galaxy filled with warring, hate-filled, backward planets, should be the only ones who base their entire existence on a complicated series of games? End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3 of Planet of the Damned by Harry Harrison. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3. This time there was no way to hold the door. Igel didn't try. He stepped aside, and 2 men stumbled into the room. He walked out behind their backs without saying a word. What happened? What did he do? The doctor asked, rushing in through the ruined door. He swept a glance over the continuous recording dials at the foot of Brian's bed. Respiration, temperature, heart, blood pressure, all were normal. The patient lay quietly and didn't answer him. For the rest of that day, Brian had much to think about. It was difficult. The fatigue, mixed with the tranquilizers and other drugs, had softened his contact with reality. His thoughts kept echoing back and forth in his mind, unable to escape. What had Igel meant? What was that nonsense about Anvar? Anvar was that way because, well, it just was. It had come about naturally. Or had it? The planet had a very simple history. From the very beginning, there had never been anything of real commercial interest on Anvar. Well off the interstellar trade routes, there were no minerals worth digging and transporting the immense distances to the nearest inhabited worlds. Hunting the winter beasts for their pelts was a profitable but very minor enterprise, never sufficient for mass markets. Therefore, no organized attempt had ever been made to colonize the planet. In the end, it had been settled completely by chance. A number of off-planet scientific groups had established observation and research stations, finding unlimited data to observe and record during Anvar's unusual yearly cycle. The long-duration observations encouraged the scientific workers to bring their families, and slowly but steadily small settlements grew up. Many of the fur hunters settled there as well, adding to the small population. This had been the beginning. Few records existed for those early days, and the first 6 centuries of Anvarian history were more speculation than fact. The breakdown occurred about that time, and in the galaxy-wide disruption, Anvar had to fight its own internal battle. When the Earth Empire collapsed, it was the end of more than an era. Many of the observation stations found themselves representing institutions that no longer existed. The professional hunters no longer had markets for their furs, since Anvar possessed no interstellar ships of its own. There had been no real physical hardship involved in the breakdown as it affected Anvar, since the planet was completely self-sufficient. Once they had made the mental adjustment to the fact that they were now a sovereign world, not a collection of casual visitors with various loyalties, life continued unchanged. Not easy. Living on Anvar is never easy, but at least without difference on the surface. The thoughts and attitudes of the people were, however, going through a great transformation. Many attempts were made to develop some form of stable society and social relationship. Again, little record exists of these early trials, other than the fact that they culminated in the 20s. To understand the 20s, you have to understand the unusual orbit that Anvar tracks around its sun, 70 Ophiuchi. There are other planets in this system, all of them more or less conforming to the plane of the ecliptic. Anvar is obviously a rogue, perhaps a captured planet of another sun. For the greatest part of its 780-day year, it arcs far out from its primary in a high-angled, sweeping cometary orbit. When it returns, there is a brief, hot summer of approximately 80 days, before the long winter sets in once more. This severe difference in seasonal change has caused profound adaptations in the native life forms. During the winter, most of the animals hibernate, the vegetable life lying dormant as spores or seeds. Some of the warm-blooded herbivores stay active in the snow-covered tropics, preyed upon by fur-insulated carnivores. Though unbelievably cold, the winter is a season of peace in comparison to the summer. For summer is a time of mad growth. Plants burst into life with a strength that cracks rocks, growing fast enough for the motion to be seen. The snowfields melt into mud, and within days a jungle stretches high into the air. Everything grows, swells, proliferates. Plants climb on top of plants, fighting for the life energy of the sun. Everything is eat and be eaten, grow and thrive in that short season. Because when the first snow of winter falls again, 90% of the year must pass until the next coming of warmth. Mankind has had to adapt to the Anvarian cycle in order to stay alive. Food must be gathered and stored, enough to last out the long winter. Generation after generation had adapted until they look on the mad seasonal imbalance as something quite ordinary. The first thaw of the almost non-existent spring triggers a wide-reaching metabolic change in the humans. Layers of subcutaneous fat vanish, and half-dormant sweat glands come to life. Other changes are more subtle than the temperature adjustment, but equally important. The sleep center of the brain is depressed. Short naps or a night's rest every third or fourth day becomes enough. Life takes on a hectic and hysterical quality that is perfectly suited to the environment. By the time of the first frost, rapid growing crops have been raised and harvested, sides of meat either preserved or frozen in mammoth lockers. With this supreme talent of adaptability, mankind has become part of the ecology and guaranteed his own survival during the long winter. Physical survival has been guaranteed. But what about mental survival? Primitive Earth Eskimos can fall into a long doze of half-conscious hibernation. Civilized men might be able to do this, but only for a few cold months of terrestrial midwinter. It would be impossible to do during a winter that is longer than an Earth year. With all the physical needs taken care of, boredom becomes the enemy of an Anvarian who was not a hunter. And even the hunters could not stay out on the solitary trek all winter. Drink was one answer, and violence another. Alcoholism and murder were the twin terrors of the cold season after the breakdown. It was the 20s that ended all that. When they became part of a normal life, the summer was considered just an interlude between games. The 20s were more than just a contest. They became a way of life that satisfied all the physical, competitive, and intellectual needs of this unusual planet. They were a decathlon, rather a double decathlon, raised to its highest power, where contests in chess and poetry composition held equal place with those in ski jumping and archery. Each year there were two planet-wide contests held, one for men and one for women. This was not an attempt at sexual discrimination, but a logical facing of facts. Inherent differences prevented fair contests. For example, it is impossible for a woman to win a large chess tournament, and this fact was recognized. Anyone could enter for any number of years. There were no scoring handicaps. When the best man won, he was really the best man. A complicated series of playoffs and eliminations kept contestants and observers busy for half the winter. They were only preliminary to the final encounter that lasted a month and picked a single winner. That was the title he was awarded, Winner. The man and woman who had bested every other contestant on the entire planet and who would remain unchallenged until the following year. Winner. It was a title to take pride in. Brian stirred weakly on his bed and managed to turn so he could look out of the window. Winner on Anvar. His name was already slated for the history books, one of the handful of planetary heroes. School children would be studying him now, just as he had read of the winners of the past, weaving daydreams and imaginary adventures around Brian's victories, hoping and fighting to equal them someday. To be a winner was the greatest honor in the universe. Outside, the afternoon sun shimmered weakly in a dark sky. The endless ice fields soaked up the dim light, reflecting it back as a colder and harsher illumination. A single figure on skis cut a line across the empty plain. Nothing else moved. The depression of the ultimate fatigue fell on Brian and everything changed, as if he looked in a mirror at a previously hidden side. He saw suddenly, and with terrible clarity, that to be a winner was to be absolutely nothing, like being the best flea among all the fleas on a single dog. What was Anvar after all? An ice-locked planet inhabited by a few million human fleas, unknown and unconsidered by the rest of the galaxy. There was nothing here worth fighting for. The wars after the breakdown had left them untouched. The Anvarians had always taken pride in this, as if being so unimportant that no one else even wanted to come near you could possibly be a source of pride. All the other worlds of man grew, fought, won, lost, changed. Only on Anvar did life repeat its sameness endlessly, like a loop of tape in a player. Brian's eyes were moist. He blinked. Tears. Realization of this incredible fact wiped the maudlin pity from his mind and replaced it with fear. Had his mind snapped in the strain of the last match? These thoughts weren't his. Self-pity hadn't made him a winner. Why was he feeling it now? Anvar was his universe. How could he even imagine it as a tag-in planet at the outer limb of creation? What had come over him and induced this inverse thinking? And as he thought the question, the answer appeared at the same instant. Winner Igel, the fat man with the strange pronouncements and probing questions. Had he cast a spell like some sorcerer or the devil in Faust? No, that was pure nonsense. But he had done something. Perhaps planted a suggestion when Brian's resistance was low, or used subliminal vocalization like the villain in Cerebus Chained. Brian could find no adequate reason on which to base his suspicion, but he knew with sure positiveness that iGel was responsible. He whistled at the sound switch next to his pillow, and the repaired communicator came to life. The duty nurse appeared in the small screen. "The man who was here today," Brian said. "Winter iGel. Do you know where he is? I must contact him." For some reason, this flustered her professional calm. The nurse started to answer, excused herself, and blanked the screen. When it lit again, a man in guard's uniform had taken her place. "You made an inquiry," the guard said, "about Winter iGel? We are holding him here in the hospital following the disgraceful way in which he broke into your room." "I have no charges to make. Will you ask him to come and see me at once?" The guard controlled his shock. "I'm sorry, Winter. I don't see how we can. Dr. Cullery left specific orders that you were not to be—" "The doctor has no control over my personal life," Brian interrupted. "I'm not infectious, nor ill with anything more than extreme fatigue. I want to see that man at once." The guard took a deep breath, made a quick decision. "He's on his way now," he said, and rung off. "What did you do to me?" Brian asked as soon as iGel had entered and they were alone. "You won't deny that you have put alien thoughts in my head?" "No, I won't deny it, because the whole point of my being here is to get those alien thoughts across to you." "Tell me how you did it," Brian insisted. "I must know." "I'll tell you, but there are many things you should understand first, before you decide to leave Anvar. You must not only hear them, you will have to believe them. The primary thing, the clue to the rest, is the true nature of your life here. How do you think the 20s originated?" Before he answered, Brian carefully took a double dose of the mild stimulant he was allowed. "I don't think," he said, "I know. It's a matter of historical record. The founder of the games was Giraldi. The first contest was held in 378 AB. The 20s have been held every year since then. They were strictly local affairs in the beginning, but were soon well established on a planet-wide scale." "True enough," iGel said. "But you're describing what happened. I asked you how the 20s originated. How could any single man take a barbarian planet lightly inhabited by half-mad hunters and alcoholic farmers and turn it into a smooth-running social machine built around the artificial structure of the 20s? It just couldn't be done." "But it was done," Brian insisted. "You can't deny that. And there is nothing artificial about the 20s. They are a logical way to live a life on a planet like this." iGel laughed a short, ironic bark. "Very logical," he said. "But how often does logic have anything to do with the organization of social groups and governments? You're not thinking. Put yourself in Founder Giraldi's place. Imagine that you have glimpsed the great idea of the 20s, and you want to convince others. So you walk up to the nearest louse-ridden, brawling, superstitious, booze-embalmed hunter and explain clearly how a program of his favorite sports, things like poetry, archery, and chess, can make his life that much more interesting and virtuous. You do that, but you keep your eyes open at the same time and be ready for a fast draw." Even Brian had to smile at the absurdity of the suggestion. Of course, it couldn't happen that way. Yet, since it had happened, there must be a simple explanation. "We can beat this back and forth all day," iGel told him, "and you won't get the right idea unless—" He broke off suddenly, staring at the communicator. The operation light had come on, though the screen stayed dark. Igel reached down a meaty hand and pulled loose the recently connected wires. "That doctor of yours is very curious, and he's going to stay that way. The truth behind the 20s is none of his business, but it's going to be yours. You must come to realize that the life you lead here is a complete and artificial construction, developed by societics experts and put into application by skilled field workers." "Nonsense," Brian broke in. "Systems of society can't be dreamed up and forced on people like that. Not without bloodshed and violence." "Nonsense yourself," Igel told him. "That may have been true in the dawn of history, but not anymore. You have been reading too many of the old Earth classics. You imagine that we still live in the ages of superstition. Just because fascism and communism were once forced on reluctant populations, you think this holds true for all time. Go back to your books. In exactly the same era, democracy and self-government were adapted by former colonial states like India and the Union of North Africa, and the only violence was between the local religious groups. Change is the lifeblood of mankind. Everything we today accept as normal was at one time an innovation. And one of the most recent innovations is the attempt to guide the societies of mankind into something more consistent with the personal happiness of individuals. The God complex, Brian said, forcing human lives into a mold whether they want to be fitted into it or not. Societies can be that, Igel agreed. It was in the beginning, and there were some disastrous results of attempts to force populations into a political climate where they didn't belong. They weren't all failures. Anvar here is a striking example of how good the technique can be when correctly applied. It's not done this way anymore, though. As with all of the other sciences, we have found out that the more we know, the more there is to know. We no longer attempt to guide cultures towards what we consider a beneficial goal. There are too many goals, and from our limited vantage point, it is hard to tell the good ones from the bad ones. All we do now is try to protect the growing cultures, give a little jolt to the stagnating ones, and bury the dead ones. When the work was first done here on Anvar, the theory hadn't progressed that far. The understandably complex equations that determine just where in the scale, from a type 1 to a type 5 a culture is, had not yet been completed. The technique then was to work out an artificial culture that would be most beneficial for a planet, then bend it into the mold. "How can that be done?" Brian asked. "How is it done here? We've made some progress. You're finally asking how. The technique here took a good number of agents and a great deal of money. Personal honor was emphasized in order to encourage dueling, and this led to a heightened interest in the technique of personal combat. When this was well entrenched, Giraldi was brought in, and he showed how organized competitions could be more interesting than haphazard encounters. Tying the intellectual aspects onto the framework of competitive sports was a little more difficult, but not overwhelmingly so. The details aren't important. All we are considering now is the end product, which is you. You're needed very much." "Why me?" Brian asked. "Why am I special? Because I won the 20s? I can't believe that. Taken objectively, there isn't much difference between myself and the 10 runner-ups. Why don't you ask one of them? They could do your job as well as I." "No, they couldn't. I'll tell you later why you are the only man I can use. Our time is running out, and I must convince you of some other things first." Igel glanced at his watch. "We have less than 3 hours to deadline. Before that time, I must explain enough of our work to you to enable you to decide voluntarily to join us." "A very tall order," Brian said. "You might begin by telling me just who this mysterious we is that you keep referring to? The Cultural Relationships Foundation, a non-governmental body, privately endowed, existing to promote peace and ensure the sovereign welfare of independent planets, so that all will prosper from the goodwill and commerce thereby engendered. Sounds as if you're quoting, Brian told him. No one could possibly make up something that sounds like that on the spur of the moment. I was quoting from our Charter of Organization, which is all very fine in a general sense, but I'm talking specifically now about you. You are the product of a tightly knit and very advanced society. Your individuality has been encouraged by your growing up in a society so small in population that a mild form of government control is necessary. The normal Anvarian education is an excellent one, and participation in the 20s has given you a general and advanced education second to none in the galaxy. It would be a complete waste of your entire life if you now took all this training and wasted it on some rustic farm. You give me very little credit. I plan to teach— Forget Anvar, Igel cut him off with a chop of his hand. This world will roll on quite successfully whether you are here or not. You must forget it. Think of its relative unimportance on a galactic scale, and consider instead the existing suffering hordes of mankind. You must think what you can do to help them. But what can I do, as an individual? The day is long past when a single man like Caesar or Alexander could bring about world-shaking changes. True, but not true, Igel said. There are key men in every conflict of forces, men who act like catalysts applied at the right instant to start a chemical reaction. You might be one of these men, but I must be honest and say that I can't prove it yet. So in order to save time and endless discussion, I think I will have to spark your personal sense of obligation. Obligation? To whom? To mankind, of course. To the countless billions of dead who kept the whole machine rolling along that allows you the full, long, and happy life you enjoy today. What they gave to you, you must pass on to others. This is the keystone of humanistic morals. Agreed, and a very good argument in the long run, but not one that is going to tempt me out of this bed within the next 3 hours. A point of success, Igel said. You agree with the general argument. Now I apply it specifically to you. Here is the statement I intend to prove. There exists a planet with a population of 7 million people. Unless I can prevent it, this planet will be completely destroyed. It is my job to stop that destruction, so that is where I am going now. I won't be able to do the job alone. In addition to others, I need you. Not anyone like you, but you and you alone. You have precious little time to convince me of all that, Brian told him. So let me make the job easier for you. The work you do, this planet, the imminent danger of the people there, these are all facts that you can undoubtedly supply. I'll take a chance that this whole thing is not a colossal bluff and admit that, given time, you could verify them all. This brings the argument back to me again. How can you possibly prove that I am the only person in the galaxy who can help you? I can prove it by your singular ability, the thing I came here to find. Ability? I am in no way different from the other men on my planet. You're wrong, Igel said. You are the embodied proof of evolution. Rare individuals with specific talents occur occasionally in any species, man included. It has been 2 generations since an empathetic was last born on Anvar, and I have been watching carefully most of the time. What in blazes is an empathetic? And how do you recognize it when you have found it? Brian chuckled. This talk was getting preposterous. I can recognize one because I'm one myself. There is no other way. As to how projective empathy works, you had a demonstration of that a little earlier when you felt those strange thoughts about Anvar. It will be a long time before you can master that, but receptive empathy is your natural trait. This is mentally entering into the feelings, or what could be called the spirit, of another person. Empathy is not thought perception. It might be better described as the sensing of someone else's emotional makeup, feelings, and attitudes. You can't lie to a trained empathetic, because he can sense the real attitude behind the verbal lies. Even your undeveloped talent has proved immensely useful in the 20s. You can outguess your opponent because you know his movements even and his body tenses to make them. You accept this without ever questioning it. How do you know? This was Brian's understood but never voiced secret. Igel smiled. Just guessing. But I won the 20s too, remember. Also without knowing a thing about empathy at the time. On top of our normal training, it's a wonderful trait to have. Which brings me to the proof we mentioned a minute ago. When you said you would be convinced if I could prove you were the only person who could help me, I believe you are. And that is one thing I cannot lie about. It's possible to lie about a belief verbally, to have a falsely based belief, or to change a belief, but you can't lie about it to yourself. Equally important, you can't lie about a belief to an empathetic. Would you like to see how I feel about this? See is a bad word. There is no vocabulary yet for this kind of thing. Better, would you join me in my feelings? Sense my attitudes, memories, and emotions just as I do? Brian tried to protest, but he was too late. The doors of his senses were pushed wide, and he was overwhelmed. Dis, Igel said aloud. 7 million people. Hydrogen bombs, Brian Brand. Those were just key words, landmarks of associations. With each one, Brian felt the rushing wave of the other man's emotions. There could be no lies here. Igel was right in that. This was the raw stuff that feelings are made of, the basic reactions to the things and symbols of memory. Dis. 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 It was a word, it was a planet, and the word thundered like a drum, the sound of its thunder surrounded and was a wasteland, a planet of death, a planet where living was dying and dying was very better than living. Dis. Crude, barbaric, backward, miserable, dirty, beneath consideration planet. Hot, burning, scorching wastelands of sands. And sands and sands and sands that burned and burned will burn forever. The people of this planet, so crude, dirty, miserable, barbaric, subhuman, inhuman, less than human, but they were going to be dead. And dead they would be, 7 million blackened corpses that would blacken your dreams, all dreams, dreams forever, because those hydrogen bombs were waiting to kill them unless... You, Igel, stopped it. You, Igel. Death. You, death. You, death. Alone couldn't do it. You, death. Must have Brian Brand, wet behind the ears, raw, untrained Brian Brand to help you. He was the only one in the galaxy who could finish the job. As the flow of sensation died away, Brian realized he was sprawled back weakly on his pillows, soaked with sweat, washed with the memory of the raw emotion. Across from him, Igel sat with his face bowed in his hands. When he lifted his head, Brian saw with his eyes a shadow of the blackness he had just experienced. Death, Brian said. That terrible feeling of death. It wasn't just the people of Dis who would die. It was something more personal. Myself, Eichel said, and behind this simple word were the repeated echoes of night that Brian had been made aware of with his newly recognized ability. My own death, not too far away. This is the wonderful, terrible price you must pay for your talent. Angst is an inescapable part of empathy. It is a part of the whole unknown field of psi phenomena that seems to be independent of time. Death is so traumatic and final that it reverberates back along the timeline. The closer I get, the more aware of it I am. There is no exact feeling of date, just a rough location in time. That is the horror of it. I know I will die soon after I get to Dis, and long before the work there is finished. I know the job to be done there, and I know the men who have already failed at it. I also know you are the only person who can possibly complete the work I have started. Do you agree now? Will you come with me? Yes, of course, Brian said. I'll go with you. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of Planet of the Damned by Harry Harrison. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 4. I've never seen anyone quite as angry as that doctor, Brian said. Can't blame him. Eichel shifted his immense weight and grunted from the console, where he was having a coded conversation with the ship's brain. He hit the keys quickly and read the answer from the screen. You took away his medical moment of glory. How many times in his life will he have a chance to nurse back to rugged smiling health the triumphantly exhausted winner of the 20s? Not many, I imagine. The wonder of it is how you managed to convince him that you and the ship here could take care of me as well as his hospital could. I could never convince him of that, Eichel said. But I and the Cultural Relationships Foundation have some powerful friends on Anvar. I'm forced to admit I brought a little pressure to bear. He leaned back and read the course tape as it streamed out of the printer. We have a little time to spare, but I would rather spend it waiting at the other end. We'll blast as soon as I have you tied down in a stasis field. The completeness of the stasis field leaves no impressions on the body or mind. In it, there is no weight, no pressure, no pain, no sensation of any kind. Except for a stasis of a very long duration, there is no sensation of time. To Brian's consciousness, Igel flipped the off switch with a continuation of the same motion that had turned it on. The ship was unchanged. Only outside of the port was the red-hot blankness of jump space. How do you feel? Igel asked. Apparently, the ship was wondering the same thing. Its detector unit, hovering impatiently just outside of Brian's stasis field, darted down and settled on his bare forearm. The doctor back on Anvar had given the medical section of the ship's brain a complete briefing. A quick check of a dozen factors of Brian's metabolism was compared to the expected norm. Apparently, everything was going well, because the only reaction was the expected injection of vitamins and glucose. I can't say I'm feeling wonderful yet, Brian answered, levering himself higher on the pillows. But every day it's a bit better. Steady progress. I hope so, because we have about 2 weeks before we get to Dis. Do you think you'll be back in shape by that time? No promises, Brian said, giving a tentative squeeze to one bicep. It should be enough time, though. Tomorrow I start mile exercise, and that will tighten me up again. Now, tell me more about Dis and what you have to do there. I'm not going to do it twice, so just save your curiosity a while. We're headed for a rendezvous point now to pick up another operator. This is going to be a three-man team. You, me, and an exobiologist. As soon as he is aboard, I'll do a complete briefing for you both at the same time. What you can do now is get your head into the language box and start working on your Disan. You'll want to speak it perfectly by the time we touch down. With an auto-hypno for complete recall, Brian had no difficulty in mastering the grammar and vocabulary of Disan. Pronunciation was a different matter altogether. Almost all the word endings were swallowed, muffled, or gargled. The language was rich in glottal stops, clicks, and guttural strangling sounds. Igil stayed in a different part of the ship when Brian used the voice mirror and analysis scope, claiming that the awful noises interfered with his digestion. Their ship angled through jump space along its calculated course. It kept its fragile human cargo warm, fed them, and supplied breathable air. It had orders to worry about Brian's health, so it did, checking constantly against its recorded instructions and noting his steady progress. Another part of the ship's brain counted microseconds with moronic fixation, finally closing a relay when a predetermined number had expired in its heart. A light flashed, and a buzzer hummed gently but insistently. Igel yawned, put away the report he had been reading, and started for the control room. He shuddered when he passed the room where Brian was listening to a playback of his Disan efforts. "Turn off that dying brontosaurus and get strapped in," he called through the thin door. "We're coming to the point of optimum possibility, and we'll be dropping back into normal space soon." The human mind can ponder the incredible distances between the stars, but cannot possibly contain within itself a real understanding of them. Marked out on a man's hand, an inch is a large unit of measure. In interstellar space, a cubical area with sides 100,000 miles long is a microscopically fine division. Light crosses this distance in a fraction of a second. To a ship moving with a relative speed far greater than that of light, this measuring unit is even smaller. Theoretically, it appears impossible to find a particular area of this size. Technologically, it was a repeatable miracle that occurred too often to even be interesting. Brian and Igel were strapped in when the jump drive cut off abruptly, lurching them back into normal space and time. They didn't unstrap, but just sat and looked at the dimly distant pattern of stars. A single sun, apparently of fifth magnitude, was their only neighbor in this lost corner of the universe. They waited while the computer took enough star sites to triangulate a position in 3 dimensions, muttering to itself electronically while it did the countless calculations to find their position. A warning bell chimed, and the drive cut on and off so quickly that the 2 acts seemed simultaneous. This happened again, twice. Before the brain was satisfied, it had made as good a fix as possible and flashed a "Navigation Power Off" light. Igel unstrapped, stretched, and made them a meal. Igel had computed their passage time with precise allowances. Less than 10 hours after they arrived, a powerful signal blasted into their waiting receiver. They strapped in again as the "Navigation Power On" signal blinked insistently. A ship had paused in flight somewhere relatively near in the vast volume of space. It had entered normal space just long enough to emit a signal of radio query on an assigned wavelength. Igel's ship had detected this and instantly responded with a verifying signal. The passenger spacer had accepted this assurance and gracefully laid a 10-foot metal egg in space. As soon as this had cleared its jump field, the parent ship vanished toward its destination light years away. Igel's ship climbed up the signal it had received. This signal had been recorded and examined minutely. Angle, strength, and Doppler movement were computed to find course and distance. A few minutes of flight were enough to get within range of the far weaker transmitter and the drop capsule. Homing on this signal was so simple, A human pilot could have done it himself. The shining sphere loomed up, then vanished out of sight of the viewports as the ship rotated to bring the space lock into line. Magnetic clamps cut in when they made a contact. "Go down and let the bug doctor in," Igel said. "I'll stay and monitor the board in case of trouble." "What do I have to do?" "Get into a suit and open the outer lock. Most of the drop sphere is made of inflatable metallic foil, so don't bother to look for the entrance. Just cut a hole in it with the oversized can opener you'll find in the toolbox. After Dr. Voorhees gets aboard, jettison the thing. Only get the radio and locator unit out first. It gets used again." The tool did look like a giant can opener. Brian carefully felt the resilient metal skin that covered the lock entrance until he was sure there was nothing on the other side. Then he jabbed the point through and cut a ragged hole in the thin foil. Dr. Voorhees boiled out of the sphere, knocking Brian aside. "What's the matter?" Brian asked. There was no radio on the other suit. He couldn't answer, but he did shake his fist angrily. The helmet ports were opaque, so there was no way to tell what expressions went with the gesture. Brian shrugged and turned back to salvaging the equipment pack, pushing the punctured balloon free and sealing the lock. When pressure was pumped back to ship normal, he cracked his helmet and motioned the other to do the same. "You're a pack of dirty, lying dogs," Dr. Voorhees said when the helmet came off. Brian was completely baffled. Dr. Leah Voorhees had long dark hair, large eyes, and a delicately shaped mouth now taut with anger. Dr. Voorhees was a woman. "Are you the filthy swine responsible for this atrocity?" Dr. Voorhees asked menacingly. "In the control room," Brian said quickly, knowing when cowardice was preferable to valor. "A man named Igel. There's a lot of him to hate. You can have a good time doing it. I just joined up myself." He was talking to her back as she stormed from the room. Brian hurried after her, not wanting to miss the first human spark of interest in the trip to date. "Kidnapped, lied to, and forced against my will. There is no court in the galaxy that won't give you the maximum sentence, and I'll scream with pleasure as they roll your fat body into solitary—" "They shouldn't have sent a woman," Igel said, completely ignoring her words. "I asked for a highly qualified exobiologist for a difficult assignment. Someone young and tough enough to do field work under severe conditions. So the recruiting office sends me the smallest female they can find, one who'll melt in the first rain." "I will not!" Leah shouted. "Female resilience is a well-known fact, and I'm in far better condition than the average woman. Which has nothing to do with what I'm telling you. I was hired for a job in the university on Muller's World and signed a contract to that effect. Then this bully of an agent tells me the contract has been changed. Read subparagraph 189-C or some such nonsense, and I'll be transshipping. He stuffed me into that suffocating basketball without a by your leave, and they threw me overboard. If that's not a violation of personal privacy—" "Cut a new course, Brian," Igel broke in. "Find the nearest settled planet and head us there. We have to drop this woman and find a man for this job. We are going to what is undoubtedly the most interesting planet an exobiologist ever conceived of, but we need a man who can take orders and not faint when it gets too hot." Brian was lost. Igel had done all the navigating, and Brian had no idea how to begin a search like this. "Oh, no, you don't," Leah said. "You don't get rid of me that easily. I placed first in my class, and most of the 500 other students were male. This is only a man's universe because the men say so. What's the name of this garden planet where we are going?" "Dis. I'll give you a briefing as soon as I get this ship on course." He turned to the controls, and Leah slipped out of her suit and went into the lavatory to comb her hair. Brian closed his mouth, aware suddenly It had been open for a long time. "Is that what you call applied psychology?" he asked. "Not really. She was going to go along with the job in the end, since she did sign the contract, even if she didn't read the fine print, but not until she had exhausted her feelings. I just shortened the process by switching her onto the male superiority hate. Most women who succeed in normally masculine fields have a reflexive antipathy there. They have been hit on the head with it so much." He fed the course tape into the console and scowled. But there was a good chunk of truth in what I said. I wanted a young, fit, and highly qualified biologist from recruiting. I never thought they would find a female one, and it's too late to send her back now. This is no place for a woman. "Why?" Brian asked, as Leah appeared in the doorway. "Come inside, and I'll show you both," Igel said. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of Planet of the Damned by Harry Harrison. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 5. "Dis," Igel said, consulting a thick file. "Third planet out from its primary, Epsilon Eridani. The fourth planet is Nyjord. Remember that, because it's going to be very important. This is a place you need a good reason to visit, and no reason at all to leave. Too hot, too dry. The temperature in the temperate zones rarely drops below 100 Fahrenheit. The planet is nothing but scorched rock and burning sand. Most of the water is underground and normally inaccessible. The surface water is all in the form of briny, chemically saturated swamps, undrinkable without extensive processing. All the facts and figures are here in the folder, and you can study them later. Right now, I want you just to get the idea that this planet is as loathsome and inhospitable as they come. So are the people. This is a solido of a Disan." Leah gasped at the three-dimensional representation on the screen. Not at the physical aspects of the man. As a biologist trained in the specialty of alien life, she had seen a lot stranger sights. It was the man's pose, the expression on his face, tensed to leap, his lips drawn back to show all of his teeth. "He looks as if he wanted to kill the photographer," she said. "He almost did, just after the picture was taken. Like all Disans, he has an overwhelming hatred and loathing of off-worlders. Not without good reason, though. His planet was settled completely by chance during the breakdown. I'm not sure of the details, but the overall picture is clear, since the story of their desertion forms the basis of all the myths and animistic religions on Dis. Apparently, there were large-scale mining operations carried on there once. The world is rich enough in minerals, and mining them is very simple. But water came only from expensive extraction processes, and I imagine most of the food came from off-world. Which was good enough until the settlement was forgotten, the way a lot of other planets were during the breakdown. All the records were destroyed in the fighting, and the ore carriers were pressed into military service. Dis was on its own. What happened to the people there is a tribute to the adaptation possibilities of Homo sapiens. Individuals died, usually in enormous pain, but the race lived. Changed a good deal, but still human. As the water and food ran out and the extraction machinery broke down, they must have made heroic efforts to survive. They couldn't do it mechanically, but by the time the last machine collapsed, enough people were adjusted to the environment to keep the race going. Their descendants are still there, completely adapted to the environment. Their body temperatures are around 130 degrees. They have specialized tissue in the gluteal area for storing water. These are minor changes compared to the major ones they have done in fitting themselves for this planet. I don't know the exact details, but the reports are very enthusiastic about symbiotic relationships. They assure us that this is the first time Homo sapiens has been an active part of either commensalism or inquilinism, other than in the role of host. Wonderful! Leah exclaimed. Is it? Igel scowled. Perhaps from the abstract scientific point of view. If you can keep notes, perhaps you might write a book about it sometime, but I'm not interested. I'm sure all these morphological changes and disgusting intimacies will fascinate you, Dr. Maurice. But while you are counting blood types and admiring your thermometers, I hope you will be able to devote a little time to a study of the Dissen's obnoxious personalities. We must either find out what makes these people tick, or we are going to have to stand by and watch the whole lot blow up. Going to do what? Leah gasped. Destroy them? Wipe out this fascinating genetic pool? Why? Because they are so incredibly loathsome, that's why, Igel said. These aboriginal hotheads have managed to lay their hands on some primitive cobalt bombs. They want to light the fuse and drop these bombs on Nyjord, the next planet. Nothing said or done can convince them differently. They demand unconditional surrender or else. This is impossible for a lot of reasons. Most important, because the Nyjords would like to keep their planet for their very own. They have tried every kind of compromise, but none of them works. The Dissens are out to commit racial suicide. A Nyjord fleet is now over Dis, and the deadline has almost expired for the surrender of the cobalt bombs. The Nyjord ships carry enough H-bombs to turn the entire planet into an atomic pile. That is what we must stop. Brian looked at the Solido on the screen, trying to make some judgment of the man. Bare, horny feet, a bulky, ragged length of cloth around the waist was the only garment. What looked like a piece of green vine was hooked over one shoulder. From a plaited belt were suspended a number of odd devices made of hand-beaten metal, drilled stone, and looped leather. The only recognizable item was a thin knife of unusual design. Loops of piping, flared bells, carved stones tied in senseless patterns of thonging gave the rest of the collection a bizarre appearance. Perhaps they had some religious significance, but the well-worn and handled look of most of them gave Brian an uneasy sensation. If they were used, what in the universe could they be used for? I can't believe it, he finally concluded. Except for the exotic hardware, this lowbrow looks as if he had sunk back into the Stone Age. I don't see how his kind can be any real threat to another planet. The Nyjorders believe it, and that's good enough for me, Igel said. They are paying our Cultural Relationships Foundation a good sum to try and prevent this war. Since they are our employers, we must do as they ask. Brian ignored this large lie, since it was obviously designed as an explanation for Leah. But he made a mental note to query Igel later about the real situation. Here are the tech reports. Igel dropped them on the table. Dis has some spacers as well as the cobalt bombs, though these aren't a real threat. A tramp trader was picked up leaving Dis. It had delivered a jump space launcher that can drop those bombs on Nyjord while anchored to the bedrock of Dis. While essentially a peaceful and happy people, the Nyjorders were justifiably annoyed at this and convinced the tramp's captain to give them some more information. It's all here. Boiled down, it gives a minimum deadline by which time the launcher can be set up and start throwing bombs. When is that deadline? Leah asked. In 10 more days. If the situation hasn't changed drastically by then, the Nyjorders are going to wipe all life from the face of Dis. I assure you, they don't want to do it, but they will drop the bombs in order to assure their own survival. What am I supposed to do? Leah asked, flipping the pages of the report. I don't know a thing about nucleonics or jump space. I'm an exobiologist with a supplementary degree in anthropology. What help could I possibly be? Igel looked down at her, stroking his jaw, fingers sunk deep into the rolls of flesh. My faith in our recruiters is restored, he said. That's a combination that is probably rare, even on Earth. You're as scrawny as an underfed chicken, but young enough to survive if we keep a close eye on you. He cut off Leah's angry protest with a raised hand. No more bickering, there isn't time. The Nyjorders must have lost over 30 agents trying to find the bombs. Our Foundation has had 6 people killed, including my late predecessor in charge of the project. He was a good man, but I think he went at this problem the wrong way. I think it is a cultural one, not a physical one. Run it through again, with the power turned up, Leah said, frowning. All I hear is static. It's the old problem of Genesis. Like Newton and the falling apple, Levy and the hysteresis in the warp field, everything has a beginning. If we can find out why these people are so hell-bent on suicide, we might be able to change the reasons. Not that I intend to stop looking for the bombs or the jump space generator either. We are going to try anything that will avert this planetary murder. You're a lot brighter than you look, Leah said, rising and carefully stacking the sheets of the report. You can count on me for complete cooperation. Now I'll study all this in bed if one of you overweight gentlemen will show me to a room with a strong lock on the inside of the door. Don't call me. I'll call you when I want breakfast. Brian wasn't sure how much of her barbed speech was humor and how much was serious, so he said nothing. He showed her to an empty cabin. She did lock the door, then looked for Igel. The winner was in the galley, adding to his girth with an immense gelatin dessert that filled a good-sized tureen. Is she short for a native Terran? Brian asked. The top of her head is below my chin. That's the norm. Earth is a reservoir of tired genes. Weak backs, vermiform appendices, bad eyes. If they didn't have the universities and the trained people we need, I would never use them. Why did you lie to her about the Foundation? Because it's a secret. Isn't that reason enough? Igel rumbled angrily, scraping the last dregs from the bowl. Better eat something, build up the strength. The Foundation has to maintain its undercover status if it is going to accomplish anything. If she returns to Earth after this, it's better that she should know nothing of our real work. If she joins up, there'll be time enough to tell her. But I doubt if she will like the way we operate. Particularly since I plan to drop some H-bombs on Dis myself if we can't turn off the war. I don't believe it. You heard me correctly. Don't bulge your eyes and look moronic. As a last resort, I'll drop the bombs myself rather than let the Nyjorders do it. That might save them. Save them? They'd all be radiated and dead. Brian's voice rose in anger. Not the Dissens. I want to save the Nyjorders. Stop clenching your fists and sit down and have some of this cake. It's delicious. The Nyjorders are all that counts here. They have a planet blessed by the laws of chance. When Dis was cut off from outside contact, the survivors turned into a gang of swamp-crawling homicidals. It did the opposite for Nyjord. You can survive there just by pulling fruit off a tree. The population was small, educated, intelligent. Instead of sinking into an eternal siesta, they matured into a vitally different society. Not mechanical, they weren't even using the wheel when they were rediscovered. They became sort of cultural specialists, digging deep into the philosophical aspects of interrelationship. the thing that machine societies never had time for. Of course, this was ready-made for the Cultural Relationships Foundation, and we have been working with them ever since. Not guiding so much as protecting them from any blows that might destroy this growing idea. But we've fallen down on the job. Non-violence is essential to these people. They have vitality without needing destruction. But if they are forced to blow up Dis for their own survival against every one of their basic tenets, their philosophy won't endure. Physically, they'll live on as just one more dog-eat-dog planet with an A-bomb for any of the competition who drop behind. Sounds like paradise now. Don't be smug. It's just another world full of people with the same old likes, dislikes, and hatreds. But they are evolving a way of living together without violence that may someday form the key to mankind's survival. They are worth looking after. Now get below and study your Dissen and read the reports. Get it all pat before we land. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6 of Planet of the Damned by Harry Harrison. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 6. Identify yourself, please. The quiet words from the speaker in no way appeared to coincide with the picture on the screen. The spacer that had matched their orbit over Dis had recently been a freighter. A quick conversion had tacked the hulking shape of a primary weapons turret on top of her hull. The black disk of the immense muzzle pointed squarely at them. Igel switched open the ship-to-ship communication channel. This is Igel, Retina Pattern 490-BJ4-67, which is also the code that is supposed to get me through your blockade. Do you want to check that pattern? There will be no need, thank you. If you will turn on your recorder, I have a message relayed to you from Prime 4. Recording and out, Igel said. Damn! Trouble already and 4 days to blow up. Prime 4 is our headquarters on Dis. This ship carries a cover cargo so we can land at the spaceport. This is probably a change of plan, and I don't like the smell of it. There was something behind Igel's grumbling this time, and without conscious effort, Brian could see the chilling touch of the man's angst. Trouble was waiting for them on the planet below. When the message was typed by the decoder, Igel hovered over it, reading each word as it appeared on the paper. When it was finished, he only snorted and went below to the galley. Brian pulled the message out of the machine and read it. Igel, spaceport landing, danger, night landing preferable, coordinates map 46J92MN75, remote your ship, Vian will meet, end. Dropping into the darkness was safe enough. It was done on instruments, and the Dissens were thought to have no detection apparatus. The altimeter dials spun backwards to 0, and a soft vibration was the only indication they had landed. All of the cabin lights were off except for the fluorescent glow of the instruments. A white speckled gray filled the infrared screen, radiation from the still warm sand and stone. There were no moving blips on it, not the characteristic shape of a shielded atomic generator. We're here first, Igel said, opaquing the ports and turning on the cabin lights. They blinked at each other, faces damp with perspiration. Must you have the ship this hot? Leah asked, patting her forehead with an already sodden kerchief. Stripped of her heavier clothing, she looked even tinier to Brian, but the thin cloth tunic, reaching barely halfway to her knees, concealed very little. Small she may have appeared to him, unfeminine she was not. Her breasts were full and high, her waist tiny enough to offset the outward curve of her hips. Shall I turn around so you can stare at the back too? She asked Brian. 5 days' experience had taught him that this type of remark was best ignored. It only became worse if he tried to make an intelligent answer. This is hotter than this cabin, he said, changing the subject. By raising the interior temperature, we can at least prevent any sudden shock when we go out. I know the theory, but it doesn't stop me from sweating, she said curtly. Best thing you can do is sweat, Igel said. He looked like a glistening captive balloon in shorts. Finishing a bottle of beer, he took another from the freezer. Have a beer. No, thank you. I'm afraid it would dissolve the last shreds of tissue and my kidneys would float completely away. On Earth, we never— Get Professor Maurice's luggage for her, Igel interrupted. Vion's coming, there's his signal. I'm sending this ship up before any of the locals spot it. When he cracked the outer port, the puff of air struck them like the exhaust from a furnace, dry and hot as a tongue of flame. Brian heard Leah's gasp in the darkness. She stumbled down the ramp and he followed her slowly, careful of the weight of packs and equipment he carried. The sand, still hot from the day, burned through his boots. Igel came last, the remote control unit in his hand. As soon as they were clear, he activated it, and the ramp slipped back like a giant tongue. As soon as the lock had swung shut, the ship lifted and drifted upwards silently towards its orbit, a shrinking darkness against the stars. There was just enough starlight to see the sandy wastes around them, as wave-filled as a petrified sea. The dark shape of a sandcar drew up over a dune and hummed to a stop. When the door opened, Igel stepped towards it, and everything happened at once. Igel broke into a blue nimbus of crackling flame, his skin blackening, charred. He was dead in an instant. A second pillar of flame bloomed next to the car, and a choking scream was cut off at the moment it began. Igel died silently. Brian was diving even as the electrical discharges still crackled in the air. The boxes and packs dropped from him as he slammed against Leah, knocking her to the ground. He hoped she had the sense to stay there and be quiet. This was his only conscious thought. The rest was reflex. He was rolling over and over as fast as he could. The spitting electrical flames flared again, playing over the bundles of luggage he had dropped. This time Brian was expecting it, pressed flat on the ground a short distance away. He was facing the darkness away from the sandcar, and saw the brief blue glow of the ion rifle discharge. His own gun was in his hand. When Igel had given him the missile weapon, he had asked no questions, but had just strapped it on. There had been no thought that he would need it this quickly. Holding it firmly before him in both hands, he let his body aim at the spot where the glow had been. A whiplash of explosive slugs ripped the night air. They found their target, and something thrashed voicelessly and died. In the brief instant after he fired, a jarring weight landed on his back, and a line of fire circled his throat. Normally he fought with a calm mind, with no thought other than that of the contest. But Igel, a friend, a man of Anvar, had died a few seconds before, and Brian found himself welcoming this physical violence and pain. There are many foolish and dangerous things that can be done, such as smoking next to high-octane fuel and putting fingers into electrical sockets. Just as dangerous, and equally deadly, is physically attacking a winner of the 20s. Two men hit Brian together, though this made very little difference. The first died instantly, as hands like steel claws found his neck, and in a single spasmodic contraction, did such damage to the large vessels there that they burst and tiny hemorrhages filled his brain. The second man had time for a single scream, though he died just as swiftly when those hands closed on his larynx. Running in a crouch, partially on his knuckles, Brian swiftly made a circle of the area, gun ready. There were no others. Only when he touched the softness of Leah's body did the blood anger seep from him. He was suddenly aware of the pain and fatigue, the sweat soaking his body, and the breath rasping in his throat. Holstering the gun, he ran light fingers over her skull, finding a bruised spot on one temple. Her chest was rising and falling regularly. She had struck her head when he pushed her. It had undoubtedly saved her life. Sitting down suddenly, he let his body relax, breathing deeply. Everything was a little better now, except for the pain at his throat. His fingers found a thin strand on the side of his neck, with a knobby weight on the end. There was another weight on his other shoulder, and a thin line of pain across his neck. When he pulled on them both, the strangler's cord came away in his hand. It was thin fiber, strong as a wire. When it had been pulled around his neck, it had sliced the surface skin and flesh like a knife, halted only by the corded bands of muscle below. Brian threw it from him into the darkness where it had come from. He could think again, and he carefully kept his thoughts from the men he had killed. Knowing it was useless, he went to Igel's body. A single touch of the scorched flesh was enough. Behind him, Leah moaned with returning consciousness, and he hurried on to the sand car, stepping over the charred body outside the door. The driver slumped, dead, killed perhaps by the same strangling cord that had sunk into Brian's throat. He laid the man gently on the sand, closed the lids over the staring horror of the eyes. There was a canteen in the car, and he brought it back to Leah. "My head. I've hurt my head," she said groggily. "Just a bruise," he reassured her. "Drink some of this water and you'll feel better. Lie back. Everything's over for the moment and you can rest." "Igel's dead," Leah said with sudden shocked memory. "They've killed him. What happened?" She tensed, tried to rise, and he pressed her back gently. "I'll tell you everything, just don't try to get up yet. There was an ambush and they killed Vion and the driver of the sand car as well as Igel. 3 men did it, and they are all dead now too. I don't think there are any more around, but if there are, I'll hear them coming. We're just going to wait a few minutes until you feel better, then we're getting out of here in the car." "Bring the ship down." There was a thin note of hysteria in her voice. "We can't stay here alone. We don't know where to go or what to do. With Igel dead, the whole thing's spoiled. We have to get out." There are some things that can't sound gentle, no matter how gently they are said. This was one of them. "I'm sorry, Leah, but the ship is out of our reach right now. Igel was killed with an ion gun, and it fused the control unit into a solid lump. We must take the car and get to the city. We'll do it now. See if you can stand up. I'll help you." She rose, not saying anything, and as they walked toward the car, a single reddish moon cleared the hills behind them. In its light, Brian saw a dark line bisecting the rear panel of the sand car. He stopped abruptly. "What's the matter?" Leah asked. The unlocked engine cover could have only one significance, and he pushed it open, knowing in advance what he would see. The attackers had been very thorough and fast. In the short time available to them, they had killed the driver and the car as well. Ruddy light shone on torn wires, ripped out connections. Repair would be impossible. "I think we'll have to walk," he told her, trying to keep the gloom out of his voice. "This spot is roughly 150 kilometers from the city of Hovestad, where we have to go. We should be able to—" "We're going to die. We can't walk anywhere. This whole planet is a death trap. Let's get back in the ship." The shrillness of hysteria was at the edge of her voice, as well as a subtle slurring of sounds. Brian didn't try to reason with her or bother to explain. She had a concussion from the blow, that much was obvious. He had her sit and rest while he made what preparations he could for the long walk. Clothing first. With each passing minute, The desert air was growing colder as the day's heat ebbed away. Leah was beginning to shiver, and he took some heavier clothing from her charred bag and made her pull it over her light tunic. There was little else that was worth carrying. The canteen from the car and a first aid kit he found in one of the compartments. There were no maps and no radio. Navigation was obviously done by compass on this almost featureless desert. The car was equipped with an electrically operated gyro compass, of no use to him now. But he did use it to check the direction of Hovestad, as he remembered it from the map, and found it lined up perfectly with the tracks the car had cut into the sand. It had come directly from the city. They would find their way by backtracking. Time was slipping away. He would have liked to bury Igel and the men from the car, but the night hours were too valuable to be wasted. The best he could do was put the 3 corpses in the car for protection from the Disan animals. He locked the door and threw the key as far as he could into the blackness. Leah had slipped into a restless sleep, and he carefully shook her awake. "Come," Brian said. "We have a little walking to do." End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of Planet of the Damned by Harry Harrison. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7. With the cool air and firmly packed sand underfoot, walking should have been easy. Leah spoiled that. The concussion seemed to have temporarily cut off the reasoning part of her brain, leaving a direct connection to her vocal cords. As she stumbled along, only half conscious, she mumbled all of her darkest fears that were better left unvoiced. Occasionally there was relevancy in her complaints. They would lose their way, never find the city, die of thirst, freezing, heat, or hunger. Interspersed and entwined with these were fears from her past that still floated submerged in the timeless ocean of her subconscious. Some Brian could understand, though he tried not to listen. Fears of losing credits, not getting the highest grade, falling behind, a woman alone in a world of men, leaving school, being lost, trampled among the nameless hordes that struggled for survival in the crowded city-states of Earth. There were other things she was afraid of that made no sense to a man of Unvar. Who were the Alkians that seemed to trouble her? Or what was Kanseri, Canseri, Dadel, and Hadel? Who was Manston, whose name kept coming up over and over, each time accompanied by a little moan? Brian stopped and picked her up in both arms. With a sigh, she settled against the hard width of his chest and was instantly asleep. Even with the additional weight, he made better time now, and he stretched to his fastest kilometer-consuming stride to make good use of these best hours. Somewhere on a stretch of gravel and shelving rock, he lost the track of the sand car. He wasted no time looking for it. By carefully watching the glistening stars rise and set, he had made a good estimate of the geographic north. Dis didn't seem to have a pole star. However, a box-like constellation turned slowly around the invisible point of the pole. Keeping this positioned in line with his right shoulder guided him on the westerly course he needed. When his arms began to grow tired, he lowered Leah gently to the ground. She didn't wake. Stretching for an instant before taking up his burden again, Brian was struck by the terrible loneliness of the desert. His breath made a vanishing mist against the stars. All else was darkness and silence. How distant he was from his home, his people, his planet. Even the constellations of the night sky were different. He was used to solitude, but this was a loneliness that touched some deep-buried instinct. A shiver that wasn't from the desert cold touched lightly along his spine, prickling at the hairs of his neck. It was time to go on. He shrugged the disquieting sensations off and carefully tied Leah into the jacket he had been wearing. Slung like a pack on his back, it made the walking easier. The gravel gave way to sliding dunes of sand that seemed to continue to infinity. It was a painful, slipping climb to the top of each one, then an equally difficult descent to the black-pooled hollow at the foot of the next. With the first lightening of the sky in the east, he stopped, breath rasping in his chest, to mark his direction before the stars faded. One line scratched in the sand pointed due north. A second pointed out the course they should follow. When they were aligned to his satisfaction, he washed his mouth out with a single swallow of water and sat on the sand next to the still form of the girl. Gold fingers of fire searched across the sky, wiping out the stars. It was magnificent. Brian forgot his fatigue in appreciation. There should be some way of preserving it. A quatrain would be best, short enough to be remembered, yet requiring attention and skill to compact everything into it. He had scored high with his quatrains in the 20s. This would be a special one. Taine, his poetry mentor, would have to get a copy. "What are you mumbling about?" Leah asked, looking up at the craggy blackness of his profile against the reddening sky. "Poem," he said. "Shh, just a minute." It was too much for Leah, coming after the tension and dangers of the night. She began to laugh, laughing even harder when he scowled at her. Only when she heard the tinge of growing hysteria did she make an attempt to break off the laughter. The sun cleared the horizon, washing a sudden warmth over them. Leah gasped. "Your throat's been cut. You're bleeding to death." "Not really," he said, touching his fingertips lightly against the blood-clotted wound that circled his neck. "Just superficial." Depression sat on him as he suddenly remembered the battle and death of the previous night. Leah didn't notice his face. She was busy digging in the pack he had thrown down. He had to use his fingers to massage and force away the grimace of pain that twisted his mouth. Memory was more painful than the wound. How easily he had killed 3 men. How close to the surface of the civilized man the animal dwelled. In countless matches he had used those holes, always drawing back from the exertion of the full killing power. They were part of the game, part of the 20s. Yet, when his friend had been killed, he had become a killer himself. He believed in nonviolence and the sanctity of life, until the first test, when he had killed without hesitation. More ironic was the fact he really felt no guilt, even now. Shock at the change, yes, but no more than that. "Lift your chin," Leah said, brandishing the antiseptic applicator she had found in the medicine kit. He lifted his chin obligingly, and the liquid drew a cool, burning line across his neck. Antibio pills would do a lot more good since the wound was completely clotted by now, but he didn't speak his thoughts aloud. For the moment, Leah had forgotten herself in taking care of him. He put some of the antiseptics on her scalp bruise, and she squeaked, pulling back. They both swallowed the pills. "The sun is hot already," Leah said, peeling off her heavy clothing. "Let's find a nice cool cave or an air-conditioned saloon to crawl into for the day." "I don't think there are any here. Just sand. We have to walk." "I know we have to walk," she interrupted. "There's no need for a lecture about it. You're as seriously cubical as the Bank of Terra. Relax, count 10 and start again." Leah was making empty talk while she listened to the memory of hysteria tittering at the fringes of her brain. "No time for that. We have to keep going." Brian climbed slowly to his feet after stowing everything in the pack. When he sighted along his marker at the western horizon, he saw nothing to mark their course, only the marching dunes. He helped Leah to her feet and began walking slowly toward them. "Just hold on a second," Leah called after him. "Where do you think you're going?" "In that direction," he said, pointing. "I hoped there would be some landmarks, but there aren't. We'll have to keep on by dead reckoning. The sun will keep us pretty well on course. If we aren't there by night, the stars will be a better guide." "All this on an empty stomach? How about breakfast? I'm hungry and thirsty." "No food." He shook the canteen that gurgled emptily. It had been only partly filled when he found it. "The water's low and we'll need it later." "I need it now," she said shortly. "My mouth tastes like an unemptied ashtray and I'm dry as paper." "Just a single swallow," he said after the briefest hesitation. "This is all we have." Leah sipped at it with her eyes closed in appreciation. Then he sealed the top and returned it to the pack without taking any himself. They were sweating as they started up the first dune. The desert was barren of life. They were the only things moving under that merciless sun. Their shadows pointed the way ahead of them, and as the shadows shortened, the heat rose. It had an intensity Leah had never experienced before, a physical weight that pushed at her with a searing hand. Her clothing was sodden with perspiration, and it trickled burning into her eyes. The light and heat made it hard to see, and she leaned on the immovable strength of Brian's arm. He walked on steadily, apparently ignoring the heat and discomfort. "I wonder if those things are edible, or store water." Brian's voice was a harsh rasp. Leah blinked and squinted at the leathery shape on the summit of the dune. Plant or animal, it was hard to tell. It was the size of a man's head, wrinkled and gray as dried-out leather, knobbed with thick spikes. Brian pushed it up with his toe, and they had a brief glimpse of a white roundness, like a shiny taproot, going down into the dune. Then the thing contracted, pulling itself lower into the sand. At the same instant, something thin and sharp lashed out through a fold in the skin, striking at Brian's boot and withdrawing. There was a scratch on the hard plastic, beaded with drops of green liquid. "Probably poison," he said, digging his toe into the sand. "This thing's too mean to fool with, without a good reason. Let's keep going." It was noon before Leah fell down. She really wanted to go on, but her body wouldn't obey. The thin soles of her shoes were no protection against the burning sand, and her feet were lumps of raw pain. Heat hammered down, poured up from the sand, and swirled her in an oven of pain. The air she gasped in was molten metal that dried and cracked her mouth. Each pulse of her heart throbbed blood to the wound in her scalp until it seemed her skull would burst with the agony. She had stripped down to the short tunic, in spite of Brian's insistence that she keep her body protected from the sun, and that clung to her, soaked with sweat. She tore at it in a desperate effort to breathe. There was no escape from the unending heat. Though the baked sand burned torture into her knees and hands, she couldn't rise. It took all her strength not to fall further. Her eyes closed, and everything swirled in immense circles. Brian, blinking through slitted eyes, saw her go down. He lifted her and carried her again as he had the night before. The hot touch of her body shocked his bare arms. Her skin was flushed pink. The tunic was torn open, and one pointed breast rose and fell unevenly with the irregularity of her breathing. Wiping his palm free of sweat and sand, he touched her skin and felt the ominous hot dryness. Heat shock, all the symptoms. Dry, flushed skin, the ragged breathing, her temperature rising quickly as her body stopped fighting the heat and succumbed. There was nothing he could do here to protect her from the heat. He measured a tiny portion of the remaining water into her mouth, and she swallowed convulsively. Her thin clothing was little protection from the sun. He could only take her in his arms and keep on towards the horizon. An outcropping of rock threw a tiny patch of shade, and he walked towards it. The ground here, shielded from the direct rays of the sun, felt almost cool by contrast. Leah opened her eyes when he put her down, peering up at him through a haze of pain. She wanted to apologize to him for her weakness, but no words came from the dried membrane of her throat. His body above her seemed to swim back and forth in the heat waves, swaying like a tree in a high wind. Shock drove her eyes open, cleared her mind for an instant. He really was swaying. Suddenly she realized how much she had come to depend on the unending solidity of his strength, and now it was failing. All over his body the corded muscles contracted in ridges, striving to keep him erect. She saw his mouth pulled open by the taut cords of his neck, and the gaping silent scream was more terrible than any sound. Then she herself screamed, as his eyes rolled back, leaving only the empty white of the eyeballs staring terribly at her. He went over, back, down like a felled tree, thudding heavily on the sand. Unconscious or dead, she couldn't tell. She pulled limply at his leg, but couldn't drag his immense weight into the shade. Brian lay on his back in the sun, sweating. Leah saw this and knew that he was still alive. Yet, what was happening? She groped for memory in the red haze of her mind, but could remember nothing from her medical studies that would explain this. On every square inch of his body, the sweat glands seethed with sudden activity. From every pore oozed great globules of oily liquid, far thicker than normal perspiration. Brian's arms rippled with motion, and Leah gaped, horrified, as the hairs there writhed and stirred as though endowed with separate life. His chest rose and fell rapidly. Deep, gasping breaths racked his body. Leah could only stare through the dim redness of unreality and wonder if she were going mad before she died. A coughing fit broke the rhythm of his rasping breath, and when it was over, his breathing was easier. The perspiration still covered his body, the individual beads touching and forming tiny streams that trickled down his body and vanished in the sand. He stirred and rolled onto his side, facing her. His eyes were open and normal now as he smiled. "Didn't mean to frighten you. It caught me suddenly, coming at the wrong season and everything. It was a bit of a jar to my system. I'll get you some water now. There's still a bit left." "What happened? When you looked like that, when you fell?" "Take 2 swallows, no more," he said, holding the open canteen to her mouth. "Just summer change, that's all. It happens to us every year on Anvar, only not that violently, of course. In the winter our bodies store a layer of fat under the skin for insulation, and sweating almost ceases completely. There are a lot of internal changes, too. When the weather warms up, the process is reversed. The fat is metabolized, and the sweat glands enlarge and begin working overtime as the body prepares for 2 months of hard work, heat, and little sleep. I guess the heat here triggered off the summer change early." "You mean you've adapted to this terrible planet?" "Just about, though it does feel a little warm. I'll need a lot more water soon, so we can't remain here. Do you think you can stand the sun if I carry you?" "No, but I won't feel any better staying here." She was lightheaded, scarcely aware of what she said. "Keep going, I guess. Keep going." As soon as she was out of the shadow of the rock, the Sunlight burst over her again in a wave of hot pain. She fell unconscious at once. Brian picked her up and staggered forward. After a few yards, he began to feel the pull of the sand. He knew he was reaching the end of his strength. He went more slowly, and each dune seemed a bit higher than the one before. Giant, sand-scoured rocks pushed through the dunes here, and he had to stumble around them. At the base of the largest of these monoliths was a straggling clump of knotted vegetation. He passed it by, then stopped as something tried to penetrate his heat-crazed mind. What was it? A difference, something about these plants that he hadn't noticed in any of the others he had passed during the day. It was almost like defeat to turn and push his clumsy feet backwards in his own footsteps, to stand blinking helplessly at the plants. Yet they were important. Some of them had been cut off close to the sand, not broken by any natural cause, but cut sharply and squarely by a knife or a blade of some sort. The cut plants were long dried and dead, but a tiny hope flared up in him. This was the first sign that other people were actually alive on this heat-blasted planet. And whatever the plants had been cut for, they might be of aid to him. Food, perhaps drink. His hands trembled at the thought as he dropped Leah heavily into the shade of the rock. She didn't stir. His knife was sharp, but most of the strength was gone from his hands. Breath rasping in his dried throat, he sawed at the tough stem, finally cutting it through. Raising up the shrub, he saw a thick liquid dripping from the severed end. He braced his hand against his leg so it wouldn't shake and spill until his cupped palm was full of sap. It was wet, even a little cool as it evaporated. Surely it was mostly life-giving water. He had a moment's misgiving as he raised it to his lips, and instead of drinking it, merely touched it with the tip of his tongue. At first, nothing. Then a searing pain. It stabbed deep into his throat and choked him. His stomach heaved and he vomited bitter bile. On his knees, fighting the waves of pain, he lost body fluid he vitally needed. Despair was worse than the pain. The plant juice must have some use. There must be some way of purifying it or neutralizing it. But Brian, a stranger on this planet, would be dead long before he found out how to do this. Weakened by the cramps that still tore at him, he tried not to realize how close to the end he was. Getting the girl on his back seemed an impossible task, and for an instant he was tempted to leave her there. Yet even as he considered this, he shouldered her leaden weight and once more went on. Each footstep and effort, he followed his own track up the dune. Painfully he forced his way to the top and looked at the Disan standing a few feet away. They were both too surprised by the sudden encounter to react at once. For a breath of time they stared at each other, unmoving. When they reacted, it was the same defense of fear. Brian dropped the girl, bringing the gun up from the holster in the return of the same motion. The Disan jerked a belled tube from his waistband and raised it to his mouth. Brian didn't fire. A dead man had taught him how to train his empathic sense and to trust it. In spite of the fear that wanted him to jerk the trigger, a different sense read the unvoiced emotions of the native Disan. There was fear there, and hatred. Welling up around these was a strong desire not to commit violence, this time to communicate instead. Brian felt and recognized all this in a fraction of a second. He had to act instantly to avoid a tragic happening. A jerk of his wrist threw the gun to one side. As soon as it was gone, he regretted its loss. He was gambling their lives on an ability he still was not sure of. The Disan had the tube to his mouth when the gun hit the ground. He held the pose, unmoving, thinking. Then he accepted Brian's action and thrust the tube back into his waistband. "Do you have any water?" Brian asked, the guttural Disan words hurting his throat. "I have water," the man said. He still didn't move. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" "We're from off-planet. We had an accident. We want to go to the city. The water." The Disan looked at the unconscious girl and made his decision. Over one shoulder he wore one of the green objects that Brian remembered from the Solido. He pulled it off, and the thing writhed slowly in his hands. It was alive. A green length a meter long, like a noduled section of a thick vine. One end flared out into a petal-like formation. The Disan took a hook-shaped object from his waist and thrust it into the petaled orifice. When he turned the hook in a quick motion, the length of green writhed and curled around his arm. He pulled something small and dark out and threw it to the ground, extending the twisting green shape towards Brian. "Put your mouth to the end and drink," he said. Leah needed the water more, but he drank first, suspicious of the living water source. A hollow below the writhing petals was filling with straw-colored water from the fibrous, reedy interior. He raised it to his mouth and drank. The water was hot and tasted swampy. Sudden sharp pains around his mouth made him jerk the thing away. Tiny, glistening white barbs projected from the petals, pink-tipped now with his blood. Brian swung toward the Disan angrily and stopped when he looked at the other man's face. His mouth was surrounded by many small white scars. "The Vede does not like to give up its water, but it always does," the man said. Brian drank again, then put the Vede to Leah's mouth. She moaned without regaining consciousness, her lips seeking reflexively for the life-saving liquid. When she was satisfied, Brian gently drew the barbs from her flesh and drank again. The Disan hunkered down on his heels and watched them expressionlessly. Brian handed back the Vede, then held some of the clothes so that Leah was in their shade. He settled to the same position as the native and looked closely at him. Squatting, immobile on his heels, the Disan appeared perfectly comfortable under the flaming sun. There was no trace of perspiration on his naked brown skin. Long hair fell to his shoulders, and startlingly blue eyes stared back at Brian from deepest sockets. The heavy kilt around his loins was the only garment he wore. Once more the Vede rested over his shoulder, still stirring unhappily. Around his waist was the same collection of leather, stone, and brass objects that had been in the Solido. Two of them now had meaning to Brian: the tube and mouthpiece, a blowgun of some kind, and the specially shaped hook for opening the Vede. He wondered if the other strangely formed things had equally practical functions. If you accepted them as artifacts with a purpose, not barbaric decorations, you had to accept their owner as something more than the crude savage he resembled. "My name is Brian, and you?" "You may not have my name. Why are you here? To kill my people?" Brian forced away the memory of last night. Killing was just what he had done. Some expectancy in the man's manner, some sensed feeling of hope prompted Brian to speak the truth. "I'm here to stop your people from being killed. I believe in the end of the war." "Prove it." Take me to the Cultural Relationships Foundation in the city and I'll prove it. I can do nothing here in the desert except die. For the first time, there was emotion in the Dissen's face. He frowned and muttered something to himself. There was a fine beading of sweat above his eyebrows now as he fought an internal battle. Coming to a decision, he rose, and Brian stood too. Come with me. I'll take you to Hovestad. But first, you must tell me, are you from Nyjord? No. The nameless Dissen merely grunted and turned away. Brian shouldered Leah's unconscious body and followed him. They walked for 2 hours, the Dissen setting a cruel pace before they reached a wasteland of jumbled rock. The native pointed to the highest tower of sand-eroded stone. Wait near this, he said. Someone will come for you. He watched while Brian placed the girl's still body in the shade and passed over the Vede for the last time. Just before leaving, he turned back, hesitating. My name is Ulv, he said. Then he was gone. Brian did what he could to make Leah comfortable, but it was very little. If she didn't get medical attention soon, she would be dead. Dehydration and shock were uniting to destroy her. Just before sunset, he heard clanking and the throbbing whine of a sandcar's engine coming from the west. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of Planet of the Damned by Harry Harrison. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8. With each second, the noise grew louder, coming their way. The tracks squeaked as the car turned around the rock spire, obviously seeking them out. A large carrier, big as a truck, it stopped before them in a cloud of its own dust, and the driver kicked the door open. Get in here, and fast, the man shouted. You're letting in all the heat. He gunned the engine, ready to kick in the gears, and looked at them irritatedly. Ignoring the driver's nervous instructions, Brian carefully placed Leah on the back seat before he pulled the door shut. The car surged forward instantly, a blast of icy air pouring from the air-cooling vents. It wasn't cold in the vehicle, but the temperature was at least 40 degrees lower than the outer air. Brian covered Leah with all their extra clothing to prevent any further shock to her system. The driver, hunched over the wheel and driving with an intense speed, hadn't said a word to them since they had entered. Brian looked up as another man stepped from the engine compartment to the rear of the car. He was thin, harried-looking, and he was pointing a gun. Who are you? He said, without a trace of warmth in his voice. It was a strange reception, but Brian was beginning to realize that Dis was a strange planet. The other man chewed at his lip nervously, while Brian sat relaxed and unmoving. He didn't want to startle him into pulling the trigger, and he kept his voice pitched low as he answered. My name is Brand. We landed from space 2 nights ago and have been walking in the desert ever since. Now, don't get excited and shoot the gun when I tell you this, but both Vion and Igel are dead. The man with the gun gasped. His eyes widened. The driver threw a single frightened look over his shoulder, then turned quickly back to the wheel. Brian's probe had hit its mark. If these men weren't from the Cultural Relationships Foundation, they at least knew a lot about it. It seemed safe to assume they were CRF men. When they were shot, the girl and I escaped. We were trying to reach the city and contact you. You are from the Foundation, aren't you? Yes, of course, the man said, lowering the gun. He stared glassy-eyed into space for a moment, nervously working his teeth against his lip. Startled at his own inattention, he raised the gun again. "If you are Brand, there's something I want to know." Rummaging in his breast pocket with his free hand, he brought out a yellow message form. He moved his lips as he reread the message. "Now, answer me, if you can. What are the last 3 events in the—" He took a quick look at the paper again. "In the 20s. Chess finals, rifle prone position, and fencing playoffs. Why?" The man grunted and slid the pistol back into its holder, satisfied. "I'm Fossil," he said, and waved the message at Brian. "This is Igel's last will and testament, relayed to us by the Nyjord blockade control. He thought he was going to die, and he sure was right. Passed on his job to you. You're in charge. I was Merv's second in command until he was poisoned. I was supposed to work for Igel, and now I guess I'm yours. At least until tomorrow, when we'll have everything packed and get off this hell planet." "What do you mean tomorrow?" Brian asked. "It's 3 days to deadline, and we still have a job to do." Fossil had dropped heavily into one of the seats, and he sprang to his feet again, clutching the seat back to keep his balance in the swaying car. 3 days, 3 weeks, 3 minutes. What difference does it make? His voice rose shrilly with each word, and he had to make a definite effort to master himself before he could go on. "Look, you don't know anything about this. You just arrived, and that's your bad luck. My bad luck is being assigned to this death trap and watching the depraved and filthy things the natives do, and trying to be polite to them even when they are killing my friends and those Nyjord bombers up there with their hands on the triggers. One of those bombardiers is going to start thinking about home and about the cobalt bombs down here, and he's going to press that button, deadline or no deadline." "Sit down, Fossil. Sit down and take a rest." There was sympathy in Brian's voice, but also the firmness of an order. Fossil swayed for a second longer, then collapsed. He sat with his cheek against the window, eyes closed. A pulse throbbed visibly in his temple, and his lips worked. He had been under too much tension for too long a time. This was the atmosphere that hung heavily in the air at the CRF building when they arrived. Despair and defeat. The doctor was the only one who didn't share this mood as he bustled Leah off to the clinic with prompt efficiency. He obviously had enough patience to keep his mind occupied. With the others, the feeling of depression was unmistakable. From the instant they had driven through the automatic garage door, Brian had swum in this miasma of defeat. It was omnipresent and hard to ignore. As soon as he had eaten, he went with Fossil into what was to have been Igel's office. Through the transparent walls, he could see the staff packing the records, crating them for shipment. Fossil seemed less nervous now that he was no longer in command. Brian rejected any idea he had of letting the man know that he himself was only a novice in the Foundation. He was going to need all the authority he could muster, since they would undoubtedly hate him for what he was going to do. "Better take notes of this, Fossil, and have it typed. I'll sign it." The printed word always carried more weight. "All preparations for leaving are to be stopped at once. Records are to be returned to the files. We are going to stay here just as long as we have clearance from the Nyjorders. If this operation is unsuccessful, we will all leave together when the time expires. We will take whatever personal baggage we can carry by hand. Everything else stays here. Perhaps you don't realize we are here to save a planet, not file cabinets full of papers." Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Fossil flush with anger. "As soon as that is typed, bring it back. And all the reports as to what has been accomplished on this project. That will be all for now." Fossil stamped out, and a minute later Brian saw the shocked, angry looks from the workers in the outer office. Turning his back to them, he opened the drawers in the desk, one after another. The top drawer was empty, except for a sealed envelope. It was addressed to Winner Igel. Brian looked at it thoughtfully, then ripped it open. The letter inside was handwritten. Igel, I've had the official word that you are on the way to relieve me, and I am forced to admit I feel only an intense satisfaction. You've had the experience on these outlaw planets and can get along with the odd types. I have been specializing in research for the last 20 years, and the only reason I was appointed planetary supervisor on Nyjord was because of the observation and application facilities. I'm the research type, not the office type. No one has ever denied that. You're going to have trouble with the staff, so you had better realize that they are all compulsory volunteers. Half are clerical people from my staff. The others a mixed bag of whoever was close enough to be pulled in on this crash assignment. It developed so fast we never saw it coming, and I'm afraid we've done little or nothing to stop it. We can't get access to the natives here, not in the slightest. It's frightening. They don't fit. I've done the poison distributions on a dozen different factors, and none of them can be equated. The Pareto extrapolations don't work. Our field men can't even talk to the natives, and 2 have been killed trying. The ruling class is unapproachable, and the rest just keep their mouths shut and walk away. I'm going to take a chance and try to talk to Lig Magte. Perhaps I can make him see sense. I doubt if it will work, and there is a chance he will try violence with me. The nobility here are very prone to violence. If I get back all right, you won't see this note. Otherwise, goodbye, Igel. Try to do a better job than I did. Aston Merv. P.S. There is a problem with the staff. They're supposed to be saviors, but without exception, they all loathe the Dissens. I'm afraid I do too. Brian ticked off the relevant points in the letter. He had to find some way of discovering what Pareto extrapolations were without uncovering his own lack of knowledge. The staff would vanish in 5 minutes if they knew how new he was to the job. Poison distribution made more sense. It was used in physics as the unchanging probability of an event that would be true at all times, such as the numbers of particles that would be given off by a lump of radioactive matter during a short period. From the way Merv used it in his letter, it looked as if the Societics people had found measurable applications in societies and groups, at least on other planets. None of the rules seemed to be working on Dis. Igel had admitted that, and Merv's death had proven it. Brian wondered who this Lig Magte was who appeared to have killed Merv. A forged cough broke through Brian's concentration, and he realized that Fossil had been standing in front of his desk for some minutes. Brian looked up and mopped perspiration from his face. "Your air conditioner seems to be out of order," Fossil said. "Should I have the mechanic look at it?" "There's nothing wrong with the machine. I'm just adapting to Dis's climate. What else do you want, Fossil?" The assistant had a doubting look that he didn't succeed in hiding. He also had trouble believing in literal truth. He placed the small stack of file folders on the desk. "These are the reports to date, everything we have uncovered about the Dissens. It's not very much, but considering the antisocial attitudes on this lousy world, it is the best we could do." A sudden thought hit him, and his eyes narrowed slyly. It can't be helped, but some of the staff have been wondering out loud about that native that contacted us. How did you get him to help you? We've never gotten to first base with these people, and as soon as you land, you have one working for you. You can't stop people from thinking about it, you being a newcomer and a stranger. After all, it looks a little odd. He broke off in mid-sentence as Brian looked at him in cold fury. I can't stop people from thinking about it, but I can stop them from talking. Our job is to contact the Dissons and stop this suicidal war. I've done more in one day than you all have done since you arrived. I've accomplished this because I am better at my work than the rest of you. That is all the information any of you are going to receive. You are dismissed. White with anger, Fossil turned on his heel and stamped out, to spread the word about what a slave driver the new director was. They would then all hate him passionately, which was just the way he wanted it. He couldn't risk exposure as the trio he was, and perhaps a new emotion other than disgust and defeat might jar them into a little action. They certainly couldn't do any worse than they had been doing. It was a tremendous amount of responsibility. For the first time since setting foot on this barbaric planet, Brian had time to stop and think. He was taking an awful lot upon himself. He knew nothing about this world, nor about the powers involved in the conflict. Here he sat, pretending to be in charge of an organization he had first heard about only a few weeks earlier. It was a frightening situation. Should he slide out from under? There was just one possible answer, and that was no. Until he found someone else who could do better, he seemed to be the best suited for the job. And Igel's opinion had to count for something. Brian had felt the surety of the man's conviction that Brian was the only one who might possibly succeed in this difficult spot. Let it go at that. If he had any qualms, it would be best to put them behind him. Aside from everything else, there was a primary bit of loyalty involved. Igel had been an Anvarian and a winner. Maybe it was a provincial attitude to hold in this big universe. Anvar was certainly far enough away from here. But honor is very important to a man who must stand alone. He had a debt to Igel, and he was going to pay it off. Once the decision had been made, he felt easier. There was an intercom on the desk in front of him, and he leaned with a heavy thumb on the button labeled Fossil. Yes? Even through the speaker, the man's voice was cold with ill-concealed hatred. Who is Lig Magti? And did the former director ever return from seeing him? Magti is a title that means roughly noble or lord. Lig Magti is the local overlord. He has an ugly stone heap of a building just outside the city. He seems to be the mouthpiece for the group of Magter that are pushing this idiotic war. As to your second question, I have to answer yes and no. We found Director Merv's head outside the door next morning with all the skin gone. We knew who it was because the doctor identified the bridge work in his mouth. Do you understand? All pretense of control had vanished, and Fossil had almost shrieked the last words. They were all close to cracking up, if he was any example. Brian broke in quickly. That will be all, Fossil. Just get word to the doctor that I would like to see him as soon as I can. He broke the connection and opened the first of the folders. By the time the doctor called, he had skimmed the reports and was reading the relevant ones in greater detail. Putting on his warm coat, he went through the outer office. The few workers still on duty turned their backs in frigid silence. Dr. Stein had a pink and shiny bald head that rose above a thick black beard. Brian liked him at once. Anyone with enough firmness of mind to keep a beard in this climate was a pleasant exception after what he had met so far. How's the new patient, Doctor? Stein combed his beard with stubby fingers before answering. Diagnosis, heat syncope. Prognosis, complete recovery. Condition fair considering the dehydration and extensive sunburn. I've treated the burns and a saline drop is taking care of the other. She just missed going into heat shock. I have her under sedation now. I'd like to have her up and helping me tomorrow morning. Could she do this with stimulants or drugs? She could, but I don't like it. There might be side factors, perhaps long-standing debilitation. It's a chance. A chance we will have to take. In less than 70 hours, this planet is due for destruction. In attempting to avert this tragedy, I'm expendable, as is everyone else here. Agreed? The doctor grunted deep in his beard and looked Brian's immense frame up and down. Agreed, he said almost happily. It is a distinct pleasure to see something beside black defeat around here. I'll go along with you. Well, you can help me right now. I checked the personnel roster and discovered that out of the 28 people working here, there isn't a physical scientist of any kind other than yourself. A scruffy bunch of button pushers and theoreticians. Not worth a damn for field work, the whole bunch of them. The doctor toed the floor switch on a waste receptacle and spat into it with feeling. Then I'm going to depend on you for some straight answers, Brian said. This is an unstandard operation, and the standard techniques just don't begin to make sense. Even Poisson distributions and Pareto extrapolations don't apply here. Stein nodded agreement, and Brian relaxed a bit. He had just relieved himself of his entire knowledge of societics, and it had sounded authentic. The more I look at it, the more I believe that this is a physical problem. Something to do with the exotic and massive adjustments the Dissens have made to this hellish environment. Could this tie up in any way with their absolutely suicidal attitude towards the cobalt bombs? Could it? Could it? Dr. Stein paced the floor rapidly on his stocky legs, twining his fingers behind his back. You are bloody well right it could. Someone is thinking at last and not just punching bloody numbers into a machine and sitting and scratching his behind while waiting for the screen to light up with the answers. Do you know how Dissens exist? Brian shook his head. The fools here think it disgusting, but I call it fascinating. They have found ways to join a symbiotic relationship with the life forms on this planet, even a parasitic relationship. You must realize that living organisms will do anything to survive. Castaways at sea will drink their own urine in their need for water. Disgust at this is only the attitude of the overprotected who have never experienced extreme thirst or hunger. Well, here on Dis, you have a planet of castaways. Stein opened the door of the pharmacy. This talk of thirst makes me dry. With economically efficient motions, he poured grain alcohol into a beaker, thinned it with distilled water, and flavored it with some crystals from a bottle. He filled 2 glasses and handed Brian one. It didn't taste bad at all. What do you mean by parasitic, Doctor? Aren't we all parasites of the lower life forms, meat animals, vegetables, and such? No, you missed the point. I speak of parasitic in the exact meaning of the word. You must realize that to a biologist there is no real difference between parasitism, symbiosis, mutualism, biointergasty, commensalism. Stop, Brian said. Those are just meaningless sounds to me. If that is what makes this planet tick, I'm beginning to see why the rest of the staff has that lost feeling. It is just a matter of degree of the same thing. Look, you have a kind of crustacean living in the lakes here, very much like an ordinary crab. It has large claws in which it holds anemones, tentacled sea animals with no power of motion. The crustacean waves these around to gather food and eats the pieces they capture that are too big for them. This biointergasy, 2 creatures living and working together, yet each capable of existing alone. Now, this same crustacean has a parasite living under its shell, a degenerated form of a snail that has lost all power of movement. A true parasite that takes its food from its host's body and gives nothing in return. Inside the snail's gut, there is a protozoan that lives off the snail's ingested food. Yet this little organism is not a parasite as you might think at first, but a symbiote. It takes food from the snail, but at the same time it secretes a chemical that aids the snail's digestion of the food. Do you get the picture? All these life forms exist in a complicated interdependence. Brian frowned in concentration, sipping at the drink. It's making some kind of sense now. Symbiosis, parasitism, and all the rest are just ways of describing variations of the same basic process of living together. And there is probably a grading and shading between some of these that make the exact relationship hard to define. Precisely. Existence is so difficult on this world that the competing forms have almost died out. There are still a few left, preying off the others. It was the cooperating and interdependent life forms that really won out in the race for survival. I say life forms with intent. The creatures here are mostly a mixture of plant and animal, like the lichens you have elsewhere. The Dissens have a creature they called a Vede that they use for water when traveling. It has rudimentary powers of motion from its animal part, yet uses photosynthesis and stores water like a plant. When the Dissens drink from it, the thing taps their bloodstreams for food elements. I know, Brian said wryly. I drank from one. You can see my scars. I'm beginning to comprehend how the Dissens fit into the physical pattern of their world, and I realize it must have all kinds of psychological effects on them. Do you think this has any effect on their social organization? An important one, but maybe I'm making too many suppositions now. Perhaps your researchers upstairs can tell you better. After all, this is their field. Brian had studied the reports on the social setup, and not one word of them made sense. They were a solid maze of unknown symbols and cryptic charts. Please continue, Doctor, he insisted. The Societics reports are valueless so far. There are factors missing. You are the only one I have talked to so far that can give me any intelligent reports or answers. All right then, be it on your own head. The way I see it, you've got no society here at all, just a bunch of rugged individualists, each one for himself, getting nourishment from the other life forms of the planet. If they have a society, it is oriented toward the rest of the planetary life instead of towards other human beings. Perhaps that's why your figures don't make sense. They are set up for the human societies. In their relations with each other, these people are completely different. What about the Magter, the upper-class types who build castles and are causing all this trouble? I have no explanation, Dr. Stein admitted. My theories hold water and seem logical enough up to this point, but the Magter are the exception, and I have no idea why. They are completely different from the rest of the Dissens. Argumentative, bloodthirsty, looking for planetary conquest instead of peace. They aren't rulers, not in the real sense. They hold power because nobody else wants it. They grant mining concessions to off-worlders because they are the only ones with a sense of property. Maybe I'm going out on a limb, but if you can find out why they are so different, you may be onto the clue of our difficulties. For the first time since his arrival, Brian began to feel a touch of enthusiasm, plus a sense of the remote possibility that there might even be a solution to the deadly problem. He drained his glass and stood up. I hope you'll wake your patient early, Doctor. You might be as interested in talking to her as I am. If what you told me is true, she could well be our key to the answer. She is Professor Leah Morees, and she is just out from Earth with degrees in exobiology and anthropology, and has a head stuffed with vital facts. Wonderful, Stein said. I shall take care of the head, not only because it is so pretty, but because of its knowledge. Though we totter on the edge of atomic destruction, I have a strange feeling of optimism for the first time since I landed on this planet. End of chapter 8. Chapter 9 of The Planet of the Damned by Harry Harrison. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9. The guard inside the front entrance of the Foundation building jumped at the thunderous noise and reached for his gun. He dropped his hand sheepishly when he realized it was only a sneeze, though a gargantuan one. Brian came up, sniffling, huddling down into his coat. "I'm going out before I catch pneumonia," he said. The guard saluted dumbly, and after checking his proximity detector screens, he slipped out and the heavy portal thudded shut behind him. The street was still warm from the heat of the day, and he sighed happily and opened his coat. This was partly a reconnaissance trip, and partly a way of getting warmed up. There was little else he could do in the building. The staff had long since retired. He had slept for a half an hour and had waked refreshed and ready to work. All the reports he could understand had been read and reread until they were memorized. He could use the time now, while the rest of them were asleep, to get better acquainted with the main city of Dis. As he walked the dark streets, he realized how alien the Disan way of life was to everything he knew. This city, Hovestad, literally meant main place in the native language. And that's all it was. It was only the presence of the off-worlders that made it into a city. Building after building, standing deserted, bore the names of mining companies, traders, space transporters. None of them was occupied now. Some still had lights burning, switched on by automatic apparatus. Others were as dark as the Disan structures. There weren't many of these native constructions, and they seemed out of place among the rammed earth and prefab off-world buildings. Brian examined one that was dimly illuminated by the light on the corner of Vegan Smelters Limited. It consisted of a single large room, resting right on the ground. There were no windows, and the whole thing appeared to have been constructed of some sort of woven material plastered with stone-hard mud. Nothing was blocking the door, and he was thinking seriously of going in when he became aware that he was being followed. It was only a slight noise, almost lost in the night. Normally it would never have been noticed, but tonight Brian was listening with his entire body. Someone was behind him, swallowed up in the pools of darkness. Brian shrank back against the wall. There was very little chance that this could be anyone but a Disan. He had a sudden memory of Merv's severed head as it had been discovered outside the door. Igel had helped him train his empathetic sense, and he reached out with it. It was difficult working in the dark. He could be sure of nothing. Was he getting a reaction or just wishing for one? Why did it have a ring of familiarity to it? A sudden idea struck him. "Ulv," he said very softly, "this is Brian." He crouched, ready for an attack. "I know," a voice said softly in the night. "Do not talk. Walk in the direction you were going before." Asking questions now would accomplish nothing. Brian turned instantly and did as he was bidden. The buildings grew further apart until he realized from the sand underfoot that he was back in the planet-wide desert. It could be a trap. He hadn't recognized the voice behind the whisper, yet he had to take this chance. A darker shape appeared in the dark night near him, and a burning hot hand touched his arm lightly. "I will walk ahead. Follow close behind me." The words were louder, and this time Brian recognized the voice. Without waiting for an answer, Ulv turned, and his dimly seen shape vanished into the darkness. Brian moved swiftly after him until they walked side by side over the rolling hills of sand. The sand merged into hard baked ground, became cracked and scarred with rock-filled gullies. They followed a deepening gully that grew into a good-sized ravine. When they turned an angle of the ravine, Brian saw a weak yellow light coming from an opening in the hard dirt wall. Ulv dropped on all fours and vanished through the shoulder-wide hole. Brian followed him, trying to ignore the growing tension and unease he felt. Crawling like this, head down, he was terribly vulnerable. He tried to shrug off the feeling, mentally blaming it on tense nerves. The tunnel was short and opened into a larger chamber. A sudden scuffle of feet sounded at the same instant that a wave of empathetic hatred struck him. It took vital seconds to fight his way out of the trapped tunnel, to roll clear and bring his gun up. During those seconds, he should have died. The Disan poised above him had the short-handled stone hammer raised to strike a skull-crushing blow. Ulv was clutching the man's wrist, fighting silently to keep the hammer from falling. Neither combatant said a word, the rasp of their calloused feet on the sand the only sound. Brian backed away from the struggling men, his gun centered on the stranger. The Disan followed him with burning eyes and dropped the hammer as soon as it was obvious the attack had failed. "Why did you bring him here?" he growled at Ulv. "Why didn't you kill him?" "He is here so we can listen to what he says, Gebk." "He is the one I told you of, that I found in the desert." "We listen to what he says, and then we kill him," Gebk said with a mirthless grin. The remark wasn't meant to be humorous, but was made in all seriousness. Brian recognized this and knew that there was no danger for the present moment. He slid the gun away and for the first time looked around the chamber. It was domed in shape and was still hot from the heat of the day. Ulv took off the length of cloth he had wrapped around his body against the chill and refolded it as a kilt, strapping it on under his belt artifacts. He grunted something unintelligible, and when a muttered answer came, Brian for the first time became aware of the woman and the child. The two sat against the far wall, squatting on either side of a heap of fibrous plants. Both were nude, clothed only in the matted hair that fell below their shoulders. The belt of strange tools could not be classified as clothing. Even the child wore a tiny replica of his mother's. Putting down a length of plant she had been chewing, the woman shuffled over to the tiny fire that illuminated the room. A clay pot stood over it, and from this she ladled 3 bowls of food for the men. It smelled atrocious, and Brian tried not to taste or smell the sickening mixture while he ate it. He used his fingers, as did the other men, and did not talk while he ate. There was no way to tell if the silence was ritual or habit. It gave him a chance for a closer look at the Disan way of living. The cave was obviously man-made. Tool marks could be clearly seen in the hard clay of the walls, except in the portion opposite the entrance. That was covered with a network of roots rising out of the floor and vanishing into the roof of earth above. Perhaps this was the reason for the cave's existence. The thin roots had been carefully twisted and plaited together until they formed a single swollen root in the center, as thick as a man's arm. From this hung 4 of the Vedes. Ulv had placed his there before he sat down. The teeth must have instantly sunk in, for it hung unsupported, another link in the Disan life cycle. This appeared to be the source of the Vedes' water that nourished the people. Brian was aware of eyes upon him and turned and smiled at the little girl. She couldn't have been over 6 years old, but she was already a Disan in every way. She neither returned his smile nor changed her expression, unchildlike in its stolidity. Her hands and jaw never stopped as she worked on the lengths of fibrous plant her mother had placed before her. The child split them with a small tool and removed a pod of some kind. This was peeled, partially by scraping with a different tool and partially by working between her teeth. It took long minutes to remove the tough rind. The results seemed hardly worth it. A tiny wriggling object was finally disclosed, which the girl instantly swallowed. She then began working on the next pod. Ulv put down his clay bowl and belched. "I brought you to the city as I told you I would," he said. "Have you done as you said you would?" "What did he promise?" Gebk asked. "That he would stop the war. Have you stopped it?" "I am trying to stop it," Brian said, "but it is not that easy. I'll need some help. It is your life that needs saving, yours and your family's. If you would help me—" "What is the truth? What is the truth?" Ulv broke in savagely. "All I hear is difference, and there is no longer any way to tell truth. For as long as always we have done as the Magter said. We bring them food and they give us the metal and sometimes water when we need it. As long as we do as they ask, they do not kill us. They live the wrong way, but I have had bronze from them for my tools. They have told us that they are getting a world for us from the Sky People, and that is good. It has always been known that the Sky People are evil in every way, and only good can come from killing them," Gebk said. Brian stared back at the two Disans and their obvious hatred. "Then why didn't you kill me, Ulv?" he asked. "That first time in the desert, or tonight when you stopped Gebk?" "I could have, but there was something more important. What is the truth? Can we believe as we have always done, or should we listen to this?" He threw a small sheet of plastic to Brian, no bigger than the palm of his hand. A metal button was fastened to one corner of the wafer, and a simple drawing was embedded in the wafer. Brian held it to the light and saw the picture of a man's hand squeezing the button between thumb and forefinger. It was a sub-miniaturized playback. Mechanical pressure on the case provided enough current to play the recorded message. The plastic sheet vibrated, acting as a loudspeaker. Though the voice was thin and scratchy, the words were clearly audible. It was an appeal for the Disan people not to listen to the Magter. It explained that the Magter had started a war that could have only one ending, the destruction of Dis. Only if the Magter were thrown down and their weapons discovered could there be any hope. "Are these words true?" Ulv asked. "Yes," Brian said. "They are perhaps true," Gebk said, "but there is nothing that we can do. I was with my brother when these word things fell out of the sky, and he listened to one and took it to the Magter to ask them. They killed him, as he should have known they would do. The Magter kill us if they know we listen to the words. And the words tell us we will die if we listen to the Magter," Ulf shouted, his voice cracking, not with fear, but with frustration at the attempt to reconcile two opposite points of view. Up until this time, his world had consisted of black and white values, with very few shadings of difference in between. "There are things you can do that will stop the war without hurting yourselves or the Magter," Brian said, searching for a way to enlist their aid. "Tell us," Ulf grunted. "There would be no war if the Magter could be contacted, made to listen to reason. They are killing you all. You could tell me how to talk to the Magter, how I could understand them." "No one can talk to the Magter," the woman broke in. If you say something different, they will kill you as they killed Greb's brother. So they are easy to understand. That is the way they are. They do not change." She put the length of plant she had been softening for the child back into her mouth. Her lips were deeply grooved and scarred from a lifetime of this work, her teeth at the sides worn almost to the bone. "Mar is right," Ulv said. "You do not talk to Magter. What else is there to do?" Brian looked at the two men before he spoke and shifted his weight. The motion brought his fingertips just a few inches from his gun. "The Magter have bombs that will destroy Nyjord. This is the next planet, a star in your sky. If I can find where the bombs are, I will have them taken away and there will be no war." "You want us to aid the devils in the sky against our own people?" Greb shouted, half rising. Ulv pulled him back to the ground, but there was no more warmth in his voice as he spoke. "You are asking too much. You will leave now." "Will you help me, though? Will you help stop the war?" Brian asked, aware he had gone too far, but unable to stop. Their anger was making them forget the reasons for his being there. "You ask too much," Ulv said again. "Go back now. We will talk about it." "Will I see you again? How can I reach you?" "We will find you if we wish to talk to you," was all Ulv said. If they decided he was lying, he would never see them again. There was nothing he could do about it. "I have made up my mind," Grebk said, rising to his feet and drawing his cloth up until it covered his shoulders. "You are lying, and this is all a lie of the Sky People. If I see you again, I will kill you." He stepped to the tunnel and was gone. There was nothing more to be said. Brian went out next, checking carefully to be sure that Gebk really had left, and Ulv guided him to the spot where the lights of Hovstad were visible. He did not speak during their return journey, and vanished without a word. Brian shivered in the night chill of the air, and wrapped his coat more tightly about him. Depressed, he walked back toward the warmer streets of the city. It was dawn when he reached the Foundation building. A new guard was at the front entrance. No amount of hammering or threats could convince the man to open until Fossil came down, yawning and blinking with sleep. He was starting some complaint when Brian cut him off curtly and ordered him to finish dressing and report for work at once. Still feeling elated, Brian hurried into his office and cursed the overly efficient character who had turned on his air conditioner to chill the room again. When he turned it off this time, he removed enough vital parts to keep it out of order for the duration. When Fossil came in, he was still yawning behind his fist, obviously a low morning sugar type. "Before you fall on your face, go out and get some coffee," Brian said. "2 cups. I'll have a cup too." "That won't be necessary," Fossil said, drawing himself up stiffly. "I'll call the canteen if you wish some." He said it in the iciest tone he could manage this early in the morning. In his enthusiasm, Brian had forgotten the hate campaign he had directed against himself. "Suit yourself," he said shortly, getting back into the role. "But the next time you yawn, there'll be a negative entry in your service record. If that's clear, you can brief me on this organization's visible relations with the Dissens. How do they take us?" Fossil choked and swallowed a yawn. "I believe they look on the CRF people as some species of simpletons, sir. They hate all off-worlders. Memory of their desertion has been passed on verbally for generations. So by their one-to-one logic, we should either hate back or go away. We stay instead, and we give them food, water, medicine, and artifacts. Because of this, they let us remain on sufferance. I imagine they consider us do-gooder idiots, and as long as we cause no trouble, they'll let us stay." He shrugged miserably to suppress a yawn, so Brian turned his back and gave him a chance to get it out. What about the Night Orders? How much do they know of our work? Brian looked out the window at dusty buildings, outlined in purple against the violent colors of the desert sunrise. Nyjord is a cooperating planet and has full knowledge at all executive levels. They are giving us all the aid they can. Well, now is the time to ask for more. Can I contact the commander of the blockading fleet? There is a scrambler connection right through to him. I'll set it up. Fossil bent over the desk and punched a number into the phone controls. The screen flowed with the black and white patterns of the scrambler. That's all, Fossil, Brian said. I want privacy for this talk. What's the commander's name? Professor Kraft. He's a physicist. They have no military men at all, so they called him in for the construction of the bombs and energy weapons. He's still in charge. Fossil yawned extravagantly as he went out the door. The Professor Commander was very old, with wispy gray hair and a network of wrinkles surrounding his eyes. His image shimmered, then cleared as the scrambler units aligned. You must be Brian Brand, he said. I have to tell you how sorry we all are that your friend Igel and the two others had to die after coming so far to help us. I'm sure you are very happy to have had a friend like that. Why, yes, of course, Brian said, reaching for the scattered fragments of his thought processes. It took an effort to remember the first conflict, now that he was worrying about the death of a planet. It's very kind of you to mention it, but I would like to find out a few things from you if I could. Anything at all. We are at your disposal. Before we begin, though, I shall pass on the thanks of our council for your aid in joining us. Even if we are eventually forced to drop the bombs, we shall never forget that your organization did everything possible to avert the disaster. Once again, Brian was caught off balance. For an instant, he wondered if Kraft was being insincere, then recognized the baseness of this thought. The completeness of the man's humanity was obvious and compelling. The thought passed through Brian's mind that now he had an additional reason for wanting the war ended without destruction on either side. He very much wanted to visit Nyjord to see these people on their home grounds. Professor Kraft waited, patiently and silently, while Brian pulled his thoughts together and answered. I still hope that this thing can be stopped in time. That's what I wanted to talk to you about. I want to see Lig Magte, and I thought it would be better if I had a legitimate reason. Are you in contact with him? Kraft shook his head. No, not really in contact. When this trouble started, I sent him a transceiver so we could talk directly, but he has delivered his ultimatum speaking for the Magter. The only terms he will hear are unconditional surrender. His receiver is on, but he has said that it is the only message he will answer. Not much chance of him ever being told that, Brian said. There was, at one time. I hope you realize, Brian, that the decision to bomb Dis was not easily arrived at. A great many people, myself included, voted for unconditional surrender. We lost the vote by a very small margin. Brian was getting used to these philosophical body blows, and he rolled with the punches now. Are there any of your people left on this planet, or do you have any troops I can call on for help? This is still a remote possibility, but if I do find out where the bombs or the launchers are, a surprise raid would knock them out. We have no people left in Hovestad now. All the ones who weren't evacuated were killed. But there are commando teams standing by here to make a landing if the weapons are detected. The Dissens must depend on secrecy to protect their armament, since we have both the manpower and the technology to reach any objective. We also have technicians and other volunteers looking for the weapon sites. They have not been successful as yet, and most of them were killed soon after landing. Kraft hesitated for a moment. There is another group you should know about. You will need all the factors. Some of our people are in the desert outside of Hovestad. We do not officially approve of them, though they have a good deal of popular support. They are mostly young men, operating as raiders, killing and destroying with very little compunction. They are attempting to uncover the weapons by sheer strength of arms. This was the best news yet. Brian controlled his voice and kept his expression calm when he spoke. I don't know how far I can stretch your cooperation, but could you possibly tell me how to get in touch with them? Kraft allowed himself a small smile. I'll give you the wavelength on which you can reach their radio. They call themselves the Nyjord Army. When you talk to them, you can do me a favor. Pass on a message. Just to prove things aren't bad enough, they've become a little worse. One of our technical crews has detected jump space energy transmissions in the planetary crust. The Dissens are apparently testing their projector sooner than we had estimated. Our deadline has been revised by 1 day. I'm afraid there are only 2 days left before you must evacuate. His eyes were large with compassion. I'm sorry. I know this will make your job that much harder. Brian didn't want to think about the loss of a full day from his already close deadline. Have you told the Dissens this yet? No, Kraft told him. The decision was reached a few minutes before your call. It is going on the radio to Lig Magte now. Can you cancel the transmission and let me take the message in person? I can do that, Kraft thought for a moment. But it would surely mean your death at their hands. They have no hesitation in killing any of our people. I would prefer to send it by radio. If you do that, you will be interfering with my plans, and perhaps destroying them under the guise of saving my life. Isn't my life my own, to dispose of as I will? For the first time, Professor Kraft was upset. I'm sorry, terribly sorry. I'm letting my concern and worry wash over into my public affairs. Of course, you may do as you please. I could never think of stopping you. He turned and said something inaudible off-screen. The call is cancelled. The responsibility is yours. All our wishes for success go with you. End of transmission. End of transmission, Brian said, and the screen went dark. Fossil, he shouted into the intercom. Get me the best and fastest sand car we have. A driver who knows his way around and 2 men who can handle a gun and know how to take orders. We're going to get some positive action at last. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of Planet of the Damned by Harry Harrison. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10. It's suicide, the taller guard grumbled. Mine, not yours, so don't worry about it, Brian barked at him. Your job is to remember your orders and keep them straight. Now, let's hear them again. The guard rolled his eyes up in silent rebellion and repeated in a toneless voice. We stay here in the car and keep the motor running while you go inside the stone pile there. We don't let anybody in the car, and we try to keep them clear of the car, short of shooting them, that is. We don't come in, no matter what happens or what it looks like, but wait for you here. Unless you call on the radio, in which case we come in with the automatics going and shoot the place up, and it doesn't matter who we hit. This will be done only as a last resort. See if you can arrange that last resort thing, the other guard said, patting the heavy blue barrel of his weapon. I meant that last resort, Brian said angrily. If any guns go off without my permission, you will pay for it, and pay with your necks. I want that clearly understood. You are here as a rear guard and as a base for me to get back to. This is my operation and mine alone, unless I call you in. Understood? He waited until all 3 men had nodded in agreement, then checked the charge on his gun. It was fully loaded. It would be foolish to go in unarmed, but he had to. One gun wouldn't save him. He put it aside. The button radio on his collar was working and had a strong enough signal to get through any number of walls. He took off his coat, threw open the door, and stepped out into the searing brilliance of the Disan noon. There was only the desert silence, broken by the steady throb of the car's motor behind him. Stretching away to the horizon in every direction was the eternal desert of sand. The keep stood nearby, solitary, a massive pile of black rock. Brian plodded closer, watching for any motion from within the walls. Nothing stirred. The high-walled, irregularly shaped construction sat in a ponderous silence. Brian was sweating now, only partially from the heat. He circled the thing, looking for a gate. There wasn't one at ground level. A slanting cleft in the stone could be climbed easily, but it seemed incredible that this might be the only entrance. A complete circuit proved that it was. Brian looked unhappily at the slanting and broken ramp, then cupped his hands and shouted loudly, "I'm coming up! Your radio doesn't work anymore. I'm bringing the message from Nyjord that you have been waiting to hear." This was a slight bending of the truth without fracturing it. There was no answer, just the hiss of wind-blown sand against the rock and the mutter of the car in the background. He started to climb. The rock underfoot was crumbling, and he had to watch where he put his feet. At the same time, he fought a constant impulse to look up, watching for anything falling from above. Nothing happened. When he reached the top of the wall, he was breathing hard, sweat moistening his body. There was still no one in sight. He stood on an unevenly shaped wall that appeared to circle the building. Instead of having a courtyard inside it, the wall was the outer face of the structure, the domed roof rising from it. At varying intervals, dark openings gave access to the interior. When Brian looked down, the sand car was just a dun-colored bump in the desert, already far behind him. Stooping, he went through the nearest door. There was still no one in sight. The room inside was something out of a madman's funhouse. It was higher than it was wide, irregular in shape, and more like a hallway than a room. At one end, it merged into an incline that became a stairwell. At the other end, in a hole that vanished in darkness below. Light of sorts filtered in through slots and holes drilled into the thick stone wall. Everything was built of the same crumbled, textured, but strong rock. Brian took the stairs. After a number of blind passages and wrong turns, he saw a stronger light ahead and went on. There was food, metal, even artifacts of the unusual Disan design in the different rooms he passed through, yet no people. The light ahead grew stronger, and the last passageway opened and swelled out until it led into the large central chamber. This was the heart of the strange structure. All the rooms, passageways, and halls existed just to give form to this gigantic chamber. The walls rose sharply, the room being circular in cross-section and growing narrower towards the top. It was a truncated cone, since there was no ceiling. A hot blue disk of sky cast light on the floor below. On the floor stood a knot of men who stared at Brian. Out of the corner of his eyes, and with the very periphery of his consciousness, he was aware of the rest of the room: barrels, stores, machinery, a radio transceiver, various bundles and heaps that made no sense at first glance. There was no time to look closer. Every fraction of his attention was focused on the muffled and hooded men. He had found the enemy. Everything that had happened to him so far on Dis had been a preparation for this moment. The attack in the desert, the escape, the dreadful heat of the sun and sand, all this had tempered and prepared him. It had been nothing in itself. Now the battle would begin in earnest. None of this was conscious in his mind. His fighter's reflexes bent his shoulders, curved his hands before him as he walked softly in balance, ready to spring in any direction. Yet none of this was really necessary. All the danger so far was non-physical. When he did give conscious thought to the situation, he stopped, startled. What was wrong here? None of the men had moved or made a sound. How could he even know they were men? They were so muffled and wrapped in cloth that only their eyes were exposed. No doubt, however, existed in Brian's mind. In spite of muffled cloth and silence, he knew them for what they were. The eyes were empty of expression and unmoving, yet were filled with the same negative emptiness as those of a bird of prey. They could look on life, death, and the rending of flesh with the same lack of interest and compassion. All this Brian knew in an instant of time, without words being spoken. Between the time he lifted one foot and walked a step, he understood what he had to face. There could be no doubt, not to an empathetic. From the group of silent men poured a frost-white wave of unemotion. An empathetic shares what other men feel. He gets his knowledge of their reaction by sensing lightly their emotions, the surges of interest, hate, love, fear, desire, the sweep of large and small sensations that accompany all thought and action. The empathetic is always aware of this constant and silent surge, whether he makes the effort to understand it or not. He is like a man glancing across the open pages of a table full of books. He can see that the type, words, paragraph, thoughts are there, even without focusing his attention to understand any of it. Then how does the man feel when he glances at the open books and sees only blank pages? The books are there, the words are not. He turns the pages of one, of the others, flipping the pages, searching for meaning. There is no meaning. All the pages are blank. This was the way in which the magter were blank, without emotions. There was a barely sensed surge and return that must have been neural impulses on a basic level, the automatic adjustments of nerve and muscle that keep an organism alive. Nothing more. Brian reached for other sensations, but there was nothing there to grasp. Either these men were without emotions, or they were able to block them from his detection. It was impossible to tell which. Very little time had passed while Brian made these discoveries. The knot of men still looked at him, silent and unmoving. They weren't expectant. Their attitude could not have been called one of interest. But he had come to them, and now they waited to find out why. Any questions or statements they spoke would be superfluous, so they didn't speak. The responsibility was his. I have come to talk with Lig Magte. Who is he? Brian didn't like the tiny noise his voice made in the immense room. One of the men gave a slight motion to draw attention to himself. None of the others moved. They still waited. I have a message for you, Brian said, speaking slowly to fill the silence of the room and the emptiness of his thoughts. This had to be handled right, but what was right? I'm from the Foundation in the city, as you undoubtedly know. I've been talking to the people of Nyjord. They have a message for you. The silence grew longer. Brian had no intention of making this a monologue. He needed facts to operate, to form an opinion. Looking at the silent forms was telling him nothing. Time stretched taut, and finally Lig Magte spoke. "The Nyjorders are going to surrender." It was an impossibly strange sentence. Brian had never realized before how much of the content of speech was made up of emotion. If the man had given it a positive emphasis, perhaps said it with enthusiasm, it would have meant success. The enemy is going to surrender. This wasn't the meaning. With a rising inflection on the end, it would have been a question. Are they going to surrender? It was neither of these. The sentence carried no other message than that contained in the simplest meanings of the separate words. It had intellectual connotations, but these could only be gained from past knowledge, not from the sound of the words. There was only one message they were prepared to receive from Nyjord. Therefore, Brian was bringing the message. If that was not the message Brian was bringing, the men here were not interested. This was the vital fact. If they were not interested, he could have no further value to them. Since he came from the enemy, he was the enemy. Therefore, he would be killed. Because this was vital to his existence, Brian took the time to follow the thought through. It made logical sense. And logic was all he could depend on now. He could be talking to robots or alien creatures for all the human response he was receiving. You can't win this war. All you can do is hurry your own deaths. He said this with as much conviction as he could, realizing at the same time that it was wasted effort. No flicker of response stirred in the men before him. The Nyjorders know you have the cobalt bombs, and they have detected your jump space projector. They can't take any more chances. They have pushed the deadline closer by an entire day. There are 1.5 days left before the bombs fall and you are all destroyed. Do you realize what that means? Is that the message? Lig Magte asked. Yes, Brian said. Two things saved his life then. He had guessed what would happen as soon as they had his message, though he hadn't been sure. But even the suspicion had put him on his guard. This, combined with the reflexes of a winner of the 20s, was barely enough to enable him to survive. From frozen immobility, Lig Magte had catapulted into headlong attack. As he leaped forward, he drew a curved, double-edged blade from under his robes. It plunged unerringly through the spot where Brian's body had been an instant before. There had been no time to tense his muscles and jump, just the space of time to relax them and fall to one side. His reasoning mind joined the battle as he hit the floor. Lig Magte plunged by him, turning and bringing the knife down at the same time. Brian's foot lashed out and caught the other man's leg, sending him sprawling. They were both on their feet at the same instant, facing each other. Brian now had his hands clasped before him in the unarmed man's best defense against a knife, the two arms protecting the body. The two hands joined to beat aside the knife arm from whichever direction it came. The Disan hunched low, flipped the knife quickly from hand to hand, then thrust it again at Brian's midriff. Only by the merest fractional margin did Brian evade the attack for the second time. Lig Magte fought with utter violence. Every action was as intense as possible, deadly and thorough. There could be only one end to this unequal contest if Brian stayed on the defensive. The man with the knife had to win. With the next charge, Brian changed tactics. He leaped inside the thrust, clutching the knife arm. A burning slice of pain cut across his arm, then his fingers clutched the tendoned wrist. They clamped down hard, grinding shut, compressing with the tightening intensity of a closing vice. It was all he could do simply to hold on. There was no science in it, just his greater strength from exercise and existence on a heavier planet. All of this strength went to his clutching hand, because he held his own life in that hand, forcing away the knife that wanted to terminate it forever. Nothing else mattered, neither the frightening force of the knees that thudded into his body, nor the hooked fingers that reached for his eyes to tear them out. He protected his face as well as he could, while the nails tore furrows through his flesh and the cut on his arm bled freely. These were only minor things to be endured. His life depended on the grasp of the fingers of his right hand. There was a sudden immobility as Brian succeeded in clutching Lig Magte's other arm. It was a good grip, and he could hold the arm immobilized. They had reached stasis, standing knee to knee, their faces only a few inches apart. The muffling cloth had fallen from the Disan's face during the struggle, and empty, frigid eyes stared into Brian's. No flicker of emotion crossed the harsh planes of the other man's face. A great puckered white scar covered one cheek and pulled up a corner of the mouth in a cheerless grimace. It was false. There was still no expression here, even when the pain must be growing more intense. Brian was winning, if none of the watchers broke the impasse. His greater weight and strength counted now. The Disan would have to drop the knife before his arm was dislocated at the shoulder. He didn't do it. With sudden horror, Brian realized that he wasn't going to drop it, no matter what happened. A dull, hideous snap jerked through the Disan's body, and the arm hung limp and dead. No expression crossed the man's face. The knife was still locked in the fingers of the paralyzed hand. With his other hand, Lig Magte reached across and started to pry the blade loose, ready to continue the battle one-handed. Brian raised his foot and kicked the knife free, sending it spinning across the room. Lig Magte made a fist of his good hand and crashed it into Brian's groin. He was still fighting as if nothing had changed. Brian backed slowly away from the man. "Stop it," he said. "You can't win now. It's impossible." He called to the other men who were watching the unequal battle with expressionless immobility. No one answered him. With a terrible, sinking sensation, Brian then realized what would happen and what he had to do. Lig Magte was as heedless of his own life as he was of the life of his planet. He would press the attack no matter what damage was done to him. Brian had an insane vision of him breaking the man's other arm, fracturing both his legs, and the limbless broken creature still coming forward, crawling, rolling, teeth bared, since they were the only remaining weapon. There was only one way to end it. Brian fainted, and the Lig Magte's arm moved clear of his body. The engulfing cloth was thin, and through it Brian could see the outlines of the Disan's abdomen and ribcage, the clear location of the great nerve ganglion. It was the death blow of karate. Brian had never used it on a man. In practice he had broken heavy boards, splintering them instantly with the short, precise stroke. The stiffened hand, moving forward in a sudden surge, all the weight and energy of his body concentrated in his joined fingertips, plunging deep into the other's flesh. Killing, not by accident or in sudden anger, killing because this was the only way the battle could possibly end. Like a ruined tower of flesh, the Disan crumpled and fell. Dripping blood, exhausted, Brian stood over the body of Lig Magte and stared at the dead man's allies. Death filled the room. End of chapter 10.